The night was colder than usual in the hills above Los Angeles, where the stars seemed to shimmer with a cold, distant glow. The sprawling mansion of Elon Musk stood out against the dark silhouette of the city, its windows gleaming under the moonlight, its high-tech security systems casting an almost eerie sense of calm. But tonight, that calm was about to be shattered. Three figures cloaked in black moved swiftly along the edge of the property. The wind rustled the dry leaves underfoot, but their footsteps made no sound. The plan was simple enough, they thought. Break in, grab the goods, and leave before anyone even noticed they were there. But as they inched closer to the massive gates, a sinking feeling began to grow in the pit of their stomachs. "Are you sure about this?" whispered Mark, the oldest and most experienced of the group. His voice trembled, though he tried to mask it with bravado. The nerves were starting to get to him. "Stop second-guessing it," replied Jake, a younger, more reckless member of the group. "We've done worse jobs, and this one's a gold mine. A billionaire's house? Come on, this is our big break. Plus, with all the gadgets and tech in there, we'll be in and out before anyone knows what hit them." But even as Jake spoke, a faint sound caught their attention, the distant wail of a siren, gradually growing louder. Mark froze, his hand on the walkie-talkie. "Did you hear that?" "Could be a false alarm," muttered Simon, the third member, a quiet tech expert who'd been key in bypassing the security system. His voice was calm, but even he couldn't hide the faint edge of concern. "Just stay focused, and let's get this over with." They crept forward, the high walls of Musk's property looming above them, like sentinels watching their every move. Mark had always been cautious, always the one to think through every possibility. But tonight, with the sirens in the distance and the tension creeping up his spine, he felt more nervous than he had ever been before. What if something goes wrong? "Focus," Simon urged, snapping Mark out of his spiral. "We've got this." They reached the outer perimeter without incident, slipping past the security cameras that had been strategically positioned to watch for intruders. Simon had already taken care of the tech side, hacking into the security system, looping the cameras, and disabling the alarm. It was almost too easy, too perfect, and yet, the nagging voice in Mark's mind wouldn't let him relax. "All right," Jake whispered, "we're here. Let's go." They approached the house, the faint sound of their breathing now the only noise in the still night. The mansion ahead of them was a masterpiece of modern architecture, its glass walls reflecting the lights of the city. It looked peaceful from the outside, but Mark knew better. Behind those walls, anything could happen. And just when things were looking too easy, just when they thought they had this in the bag, the sirens grew louder. Mark felt his heart race. What if this isn't a false alarm? He turned to Simon, who was already fiddling with a set of high-tech lockpicks. "You're sure everything's secure, right?" Simon didn't respond immediately. He was too busy concentrating on the task at hand, and his silence only added to the growing unease in Mark's gut. Yeah, just give me a second." Almost there. The minutes stretched on as they waited. The sound of the sirens was closer now, too close for comfort. But there was no turning back now. They were in this together, and the money was too big to pass up. "Just hurry up," Mark urged. His voice was low, but the tension in it was clear. Suddenly, the lock clicked. The gate swung open silently. They were in. Simon, the tech guy, pushed ahead first, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of trouble. Jake followed closely behind, his face flushed with excitement. But Mark stayed behind for a second, staring up at the mansion. It was so quiet, so still, too still. Mark's mind raced as the sirens grew nearer. Could someone be onto them already? He quickly shook off the thought. "Come on, Mark. Get it together," he muttered under his breath and hurried to catch up. The trio moved toward the back door, where Simon had bypassed another security feature. They weren't expecting anyone to be inside, but the adrenaline of the heist made every sound around them seem more intense. The lights from Musk's mansion flickered on and off in the distance, casting a strange shadow across the grounds. "Just in and out," Jake whispered, breaking the silence. But Mark wasn't so sure. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that tonight wasn't going to be as smooth as they hoped. "Let's do this," he said, trying to sound confident as they reached the door. Simon worked his magic on the lock, and the door creaked open, revealing the pristine, empty interior. As they stepped inside, the eerie silence of the mansion greeted them. It was unnervingly quiet, but the lure of the riches ahead pushed all doubts aside. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Mark wasn't sure why, but as he stepped over the threshold, he had the oddest feeling. A feeling that they were being watched. And then, suddenly, everything changed. It's easy to see the group of thieves in the dark as faceless criminals, their identities lost in the chaos of the heist. But each of them carried with them a history, a story that shaped their choices and led them to this moment. It wasn't just about the money. For Mark, Jake, and Simon, it was about something deeper, something personal. Mark had been the one to organize the heist. He was in his early 40s, a veteran in the game, and had seen it all. But in his heart, he was no longer sure why he did it. At one point, it was about the thrill, the excitement of getting away with something no one else dared to attempt. But as the years went by, it became about survival. Mark had spent most of his life making wrong choices, looking for quick fixes in a world that seemed to have no place for him. His family had long since given up on him, and the few friends he had left were either in jail or had moved on. The money from tonight's job was supposed to be his last big score. He told himself it would be different this time. He'd get out. He'd finally make things right. But deep down, Mark knew he was chasing an illusion. This wasn't about redemption. It was just about getting by. Jake was different. He was younger, eager, and reckless. At 25, he hadn't yet learned the meaning of caution, nor had he suffered enough to truly understand the consequences of his actions. He came from a broken home, raised by a single mother who had to work 3 jobs just to keep them afloat. When Jake was a teenager, he got caught up in petty crimes, stealing to get by, to keep food on the table. His mother never found out. She'd always tell him to stay out of trouble and make something of himself, but Jake didn't know how. The odds were stacked against him. So, when Mark offered him the opportunity to join a bigger job, Jake saw it as his chance to make it big, to finally break free from the constant cycle of poverty. It wasn't just about the money. It was about proving something, to himself, to his mother, and to the world that he could succeed. Simon, the tech guy, was the quietest of the group, and in many ways, he was the most dangerous. He didn't have a colorful backstory or a deep history of crime. He was just smart. The kind of smart that could get him out of any situation, but also the kind of smart that didn't care about consequences. Simon was a self-taught hacker who had spent most of his youth inside his room, staring at screens, cracking codes, and bypassing security systems. For him, it was never about the money, at least not at first. It was about the challenge. But that changed when he was caught hacking into a major corporation system a few years ago. He had been given a slap on the wrist, but the warning was clear. Either he worked with people who understood his skills, or he'd be left with nothing. Mark offered him that opportunity, and Simon had taken it without hesitation. The life of a hacker was lonely, but a life in the shadows of crime offered him something else, a kind of belonging. As they made their way through the mansion's hallways, their thoughts were a mix of excitement and fear. They had made it this far, but they knew the real challenge was just beginning. Mark, despite his years of experience, couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. He hadn't come this far in life to let a simple job trip him up. Yet, as they moved deeper into the mansion, he couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. He had seen his fair share of high-tech houses, but this place, it felt different. The silence was almost unnatural. As they passed room after room, each more extravagant than the last, Mark began to wonder, what was Elon Musk hiding here that was worth all the trouble? Jake, on the other hand, was practically bouncing with excitement. His eyes were wide, and he couldn't stop muttering about all the potential wealth that lay ahead. "Think about it, guys," he whispered. "A tech billionaire's mansion, filled with gadgets, rare collectibles, who knows what else? This could set us up for life." Simon didn't respond immediately, his attention fully on the security systems. His fingers danced across the small, portable device in his hand, bypassing the next layer of encryption with a quick tap. To him, this was just another challenge to conquer, another victory to claim. The money? Sure, that would be nice, but it wasn't the real draw for Simon. He wanted the thrill of outsmarting the system, of cracking the code that no one else could. But as the three of them continued, Mark's unease only grew. It wasn't the quiet of the house or the feeling of being watched that bothered him most. It was the sheer perfection of the place. Everything seemed meticulously arranged, like a carefully curated display of wealth and power. Too perfect. It was as if the house itself was waiting for them. Jake pulled him out of his thoughts with an excited whisper. Hey, Mark, look at this. This room. It's like a treasure chest. There's gotta be millions in here. Jake's voice was barely a murmur, but the excitement in it was impossible to ignore. Mark followed Jake into the room, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The walls were lined with futuristic gadgets, and in the center of the room was a glass case holding a sleek, high-tech device that looked like something straight out of a science fiction movie. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, and Mark realized, for the first time that night, that this wasn't just about money. They were stepping into something far bigger than they had anticipated. Let's grab it and go, Mark said, his voice steady despite the sudden tension. No more distractions. We get in, we get out. Fast. Jake grinned. You got it, boss. But Simon was already at work, scanning the walls for any other security systems that might have been overlooked. This is weird, he muttered. This place is too secure. There's more going on here than just a rich guy's collection of toys. Mark's heart raced. It had always been about the job, but now, with every step deeper into the mansion, it was starting to feel like they had stumbled onto something much bigger than themselves. The room they had entered was filled with the kind of luxury that Mark had only ever seen in magazines, never up close. Gleaming glass shelves held futuristic gadgets, rare art pieces, and the kind of tech that only billionaires like Elon Musk could afford. A giant screen on the far wall flickered to life as they approached, displaying cryptic data that seemed to belong to another world. Is this real? Jake's voice was a mixture of awe and greed. His eyes darted from one piece of expensive technology to another. Look at this stuff, man. We hit the jackpot. Mark wasn't so sure. He moved cautiously through the room, his fingers brushing against sleek surfaces, his mind racing. This wasn't just another mansion. There was something else going on here. Simon was already at work, tapping away on his device, bypassing the security systems one after another. His hands moved with precision, as though he had been trained for this exact moment. He was good, no great, at what he did. But even he was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. There was an odd energy in the air. The whole place felt like it was hiding something far more significant than expensive toys. You guys see this? Simon said quietly, his voice laced with suspicion. His eyes flickered across the screen he had activated. This place, it's like it's been mapped out. Every inch of it. There's something we're not seeing. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Simon paused, his fingers freezing on the screen. The layout of the house, it's not what it seems. This place has been designed with precision, like it's built to hide something, not just to show off wealth. Jake frowned, not entirely grasping the weight of what Simon was saying. So what? It's a rich guy's house. We grab the goods and get out, right? Mark wasn't so sure anymore. The feeling of unease that had been gnawing at him ever since they set foot on the property was only growing stronger. We stick to the plan, but we stay alert. If something feels off, we're out. Got it? Jake and Simon nodded, but the uncertainty was evident in their eyes. Just as Simon was about to start gathering data from the mainframe, an unexpected sound shattered the tense silence. A faint click echoed through the mansion. It was subtle at first, but then it became louder, almost mechanical. Mark's heart skipped a beat. He immediately motioned for the others to be silent. Did you hear that? Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Simon or Jake could respond, another sound, this one unmistakable, echoed from the hallway. The unmistakable hum of the security system rebooting. It was the kind of noise that could only mean one thing. The alarm system had just been reactivated. Damn it! Simon cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the device in a panic. It's resetting the whole system. The security will be back online in minutes. Mark's pulse quickened. How long do we have? I don't know, Simon muttered. It's a high-level system. Could be seconds, could be longer. Jake's face turned pale. So, we're stuck in here, with the security coming back online, and no way out. We follow the plan, Mark said, trying to keep his voice calm, though his stomach was churning. We stay on course, get what we came for, and get out before they lock this place down. But as they continued to move deeper into the mansion, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The security system was coming back online, but now there was something else in the air, a palpable tension. It's too quiet. Mark had been part of plenty of heists before, but he'd never felt this level of unease. There was a sense of foreboding that lingered in the air like smoke. He could hear the faint hum of the cameras and the soft beeping of sensors as they activated. But in the back of his mind, a thought kept nagging at him. What if we're not alone? Look, Mark said, his voice low. We need to split up. Get to the vault, get the cash, and we're gone. No second guessing it. Jake didn't hesitate. I'm in. Let's grab it all. His voice was full of enthusiasm, but there was a faint tremor beneath the surface. Simon, however, was already pulling up the mansion's layout on his screen. Hold up. I found something weird. There's another room, hidden, and it's not on any map I've seen. Mark's blood ran cold. A hidden room? What do you mean? Simon leaned in closer to the screen, his face illuminated by the faint glow. Look at this. The schematics for the mansion show this space, behind a false wall, near the vault. It's like it wasn't even meant to be discovered. A chill ran through Mark. This wasn't just a job anymore. They weren't just thieves looking for riches. They were about to uncover something that someone clearly didn't want them to find. You're sure it's not a trap? Mark asked, eyeing Simon carefully. I'm positive, Simon replied, his voice tense. The layout's encrypted, but I can still see it. It's real. Mark exchanged a glance with Jake. His gut told him to bail. Leave it all behind. Take the easy money and escape before things got any worse. But the temptation to see what was behind that hidden door was almost too strong. He couldn't help but wonder if it was the big break they needed, the kind of discovery that could set them up for life. We'll take a quick look, Mark decided, though the decision tasted bitter on his tongue. But we're not getting distracted. Grab whatever's useful and get out. No heroes. The trio moved toward the hidden room, their movements now slower, more cautious. The feeling that they were being watched intensified, and Mark couldn't shake the sensation that the walls were closing in. As they approached the false wall, Simon worked his magic on the sensors. A low, grinding noise filled the air as the hidden entrance slowly opened, revealing a dark, musty corridor beyond. The air in the passageway was thick with dust, untouched for what seemed like years. Mark hesitated at the threshold. This is it, the point of no return. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now. Let's go, he muttered, stepping into the unknown. The air in the hidden passage was damp and stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The faint light from Simon's small device illuminated the walls as they moved cautiously down the corridor, which seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Mark, Jake, and Simon were on edge, every footstep echoing in the narrow space as their footsteps seemed to grow louder and louder. But the tension in the air wasn't just from the silence of the passage. It was from the uncertainty of what they might find. This place feels wrong, Jake muttered, his voice hushed, but tinged with fear. He looked back at the entrance to the corridor, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the shadows. I don't like it. Mark didn't respond. His mind was racing with questions. Why was this room hidden? And why hadn't they found any trace of it in the mansion's public layout? Something was off, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the uncomfortable sting of doubt creeping into his thoughts. Simon was leading the way now, eyes glued to the glowing screen of his device. He was focused, scanning every inch of the walls and floor as they progressed. The corridor stretched on for what felt like miles, the walls made of polished stone, unlike the more modern materials used in the rest of the mansion. The deeper they went, the more it felt like they were descending into the bowels of something ancient, something much older than the sleek, high-tech mansion above. Simon, how much farther? Mark asked, his voice low. Simon glanced back, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. "We're close. Just a few more steps, I think." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Mark could hear the slight edge in his voice. Even Simon, usually calm and collected, was feeling the weight of the situation. The corridor eventually opened up into a large, dimly lit room. Mark squinted, trying to make out the details. The space was vast, almost cavernous, and the air was thick with dust. It wasn't a storage room or a forgotten part of the mansion, like they'd expected. No, this was something else entirely. There were no fancy tech gadgets or expensive art pieces. Instead, the room contained something far more ominous. A large, steel vault embedded into the wall, covered in layers of strange symbols and markings that none of them recognized. The vault's door was ajar, revealing a faint blue light coming from within. Mark's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just some hidden room. It was a place meant to hide something important, something dangerous. "What the hell is this?" Jake whispered, eyes wide. Simon stepped forward cautiously, his hand reaching out toward the symbols on the vault. "I've never seen anything like this before. This is beyond just rich guy stuff. These symbols, this design. It's not like anything you'd find in normal security systems." Mark, despite his growing unease, approached the vault slowly. Could be tech-related. Maybe it's just an experimental project. Musk has always been about pushing boundaries. But even as he said it, he knew deep down that this was far more than some tech innovation. This was a carefully concealed secret, and someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. "Let's get a look inside," Jake said impatiently, clearly eager to see what was behind the vault's mysterious door. Simon frowned. "We should be careful. This could be a trap or something we're not prepared for." But Jake wasn't waiting. With an almost reckless abandon, he moved forward and pushed the vault door open. A faint hum of electricity filled the room, and Mark's chest tightened as he watched the door slowly creak open, revealing its contents. Inside, the blue light illuminated what appeared to be a series of strange, high-tech devices that looked nothing like anything Musk had ever publicly produced. In the center of the vault, there was a glass cylinder, and inside that cylinder was a small, metallic object, glowing faintly. It looked like a piece of alien technology, or at least something that belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a billionaire's mansion. "Is that?" Mark's voice trailed off as he stepped closer, mesmerized by the object inside the cylinder. It was the size of a softball, but the glowing blue light emanating from it made it look like something out of a dream or a nightmare. Jake didn't wait for an invitation. He rushed forward, his eyes wild with excitement. "This is it. This is the jackpot." Mark grabbed his arm, stopping him just inches from the glowing object. "Hold on," he said, his voice tense. "We don't know what that is." Simon, who had been quietly scanning the rest of the room, suddenly froze. "Mark, this isn't right. We've made a huge mistake." Mark's heart dropped. "What do you mean? This is just another tech project, right? Another one of Musk's inventions?" "No," Simon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just technology. It's something much bigger. Look at the patterns on the walls. The symbols. The object, it's not just a piece of tech. It's a prototype. A prototype for something Musk's been hiding." Mark's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" Simon's face was pale now, his eyes wide with realization. This is something far beyond anything we've ever dealt with. Musk didn't just make this for profit or for show. This thing, it could change everything. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening crash, and Mark spun around in a panic. The walls of the hidden room began to shift, and the blue light inside the vault flared to life, casting the entire space in an eerie glow. A voice echoed through the room, cold and robotic, and it sent a chill down Mark's spine. "Unauthorized access detected. Security lockdown initiated. All personnel are under surveillance." Mark's mind raced. The security system was online, but this was different. This wasn't just a standard alarm. This was something else, something engineered specifically for this moment. "We need to get out now," Mark shouted. But before they could make a move, the lights flickered, and the entire room shifted as if the walls themselves were closing in. The path they had taken to enter the room was now sealed. The vault door slammed shut, trapping them inside with the strange object. Jake's breath quickened. We're locked in. What do we do now? Simon's face was ashen. This isn't just a high-tech system. This is something else entirely. And if we don't get out of here soon, we might not just be stealing from Musk. We might be stealing something that could destroy us. The tension in the room was suffocating. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the soft hum of the vault seemed to echo in the pit of their stomachs. Mark realized, with a sinking feeling, that they had just stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple heist. And there was no turning back now. The air inside the vault room was thick with tension. Every breath Mark took feeling heavier than the last. The hum of the machinery grew louder, filling the space with an ominous buzz. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the faint blue light coming from the glass cylinder cast long, eerie shadows across the room. Jake was the first to move. What the hell is going on? His voice cracked, and his eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. This wasn't part of the plan, man. We need to get out of here. Mark's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. His pulse was racing, the adrenaline surging through his veins. But there was no simple answer. How could things have gone so wrong so quickly? He had known this job wouldn't be easy. But this was something different. Simon, still glued to his device, looked up with wide eyes, his face pale. The security systems locked us in. It's going through a sequence I've never seen before. We can't just disable it. What do you mean, you can't disable it? Jake demanded, his voice rising in panic. You're supposed to be the tech guy. What's going on here? Simon's fingers flew over the small screen, trying to break through layers of encryption, but each attempt seemed to hit a wall. I don't know. This is way beyond any system I've dealt with before. It's not just some alarm. This place is rigged for a lockdown, like it's expecting us. Musk must have designed this place with a built-in fail-safe. If we didn't disable it at the start, we're screwed. Mark's frustration boiled over. We need to stay calm. Panicking won't help us get out. Let's think this through. He quickly scanned the room. The walls, once just a cold and sterile design, now felt menacing. The vault itself, which had once seemed like a mere treasure trove of high-tech gadgetry, was now a prison. The metallic object inside the cylinder seemed to pulse with energy, as if it were alive, almost mocking them with its eerie glow. What is that thing? Jake muttered, his gaze fixed on the object. That doesn't look like anything I've ever seen before. It's like it's not even from this world. Simon shook his head. I don't know. But that thing, whatever it is, it's the key to whatever this place is. I've never seen a tech prototype like this, not in any database. It doesn't match anything Musk has publicly developed. Mark's mind reeled. Musk wasn't just a tech billionaire. He was hiding something monumental in here, something that would change everything. But right now, the object inside the vault wasn't their biggest problem. It was the countdown. The lights in the room flickered again, this time more violently. The hum of the security system seemed to amplify, and a soft, mechanical voice echoed through the walls, sending a chill down Mark's spine. Unauthorized access detected. Sealing all exits. Self-destruct sequence initiated. Countdown, 3 minutes. Simon's eyes widened in horror. It's going to blow. This whole place is going down with us inside it. Mark's blood ran cold. 3 minutes. His mind scrambled. There had to be a way out. They couldn't just sit here and wait to die. Come on, Simon. Think. Jake yelled, his voice desperate. We're going to die in here if we don't do something. Simon's fingers trembled as he frantically typed on his device, his eyes darting from the screen to the vault and back. I can't hack the self-destruct. It's too advanced. This is beyond anything I've seen. Mark felt the weight of the situation crushing him. If they didn't get out of here in the next few minutes, they were done. This job was supposed to be their ticket to freedom. Now it was a fight for survival. Is there anything you can do to shut it off? Mark demanded. Simon wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, panic rising in his chest. I can try to override the system, but if I'm wrong, it could speed up the countdown. Do it, Mark ordered. We don't have a choice. Simon's hands were shaking as he worked, his face a mask of concentration. But as his fingers flew over the keys, Mark's mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the object inside the vault, the glowing device that had drawn them in. Was it just a coincidence that it was here, hidden away? Or was it the reason the self-destruct had been activated? What if the object was part of the failsafe? What if it was the real reason they triggered the alarm? He turned to Jake, who was pacing the room, eyes wild. Jake, don't touch anything in that vault. We don't know what it does. Jake stopped mid-step and shot him a look of disbelief. What are you talking about? We're going to die if we don't figure this out. Mark's voice was steady, though his heart was hammering in his chest. I know, but that thing in the vault, it's not a regular piece of tech. It's not just a gadget to steal. Musk has been hiding something, and we don't know what it could do if we mess with it. Simon glanced up, his face grim. He's right. It's connected to the self-destruct sequence. If we take that thing, it could trigger a bigger failure. We might end up making things worse. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The lights flickered again, and the countdown clock, flashing ominously on a small screen embedded in the wall, ticked down to a mere 2 minutes. Time was running out. I'm not dying for some alien tech, man. Jake snarled, glaring at Simon. You said you could hack it. So do it. Stop talking. Simon, his face pale, turned back to his device. I'm trying, but the system's too complex. I'm not sure I can stop it in time. If I get it wrong, we all go up in flames. Mark knew they were running out of options. The walls were already closing in, metaphorically and literally. If they didn't escape, they'd be trapped in a high-tech tomb, buried under the weight of their own greed. Do whatever you can, Simon, Mark urged, his voice low but urgent. We don't have a choice anymore. Just keep trying. I'll get us out of here if you don't. Simon didn't respond, his fingers working faster now, desperation creeping into his movements. Mark could feel the clock ticking away with every passing second, and in those last few moments, one thought burned brighter than the others. They weren't just stealing from Elon Musk anymore. They were uncovering a secret that could destroy everything they knew. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, the air growing colder, heavier with every passing second. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Simon furiously tap at his device, trying to bypass the security measures that were relentlessly counting down toward their doom. Come on, Simon, Jake shouted, his voice cracking with panic. His hand was clenched into a fist, his eyes darting back and forth from the vault to Simon, desperation seeping into every breath. We're running out of time. Mark felt the weight of the moment. Each tick of the countdown was like a drumbeat in his ears. The self-destruct sequence wasn't just an alarm anymore. It was a death sentence. And with each passing second, it was feeling more and more inevitable. Simon's face was drenched in sweat. His fingers moved quickly, but the system was relentless. I'm close. I think I can override it, Simon muttered under his breath. But then he paused, looking up at Mark with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. But if I get this wrong, it'll be worse. We might not just be trapped in here. We might blow this entire mansion to the ground and everything in it, including us. Mark didn't have time to question Simon's logic. The seconds were slipping away. Do it, he said, voice firm but with an edge of urgency. We don't have a choice. A loud mechanical whirring sound filled the room. Mark flinched, instinctively taking a step back. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, a low rumble vibrating through the walls. The countdown clock flashed another warning, ticking down faster than before. 1 minute remaining. Simon's fingers flew across the screen. He was doing something. They could all see it, but Mark couldn't quite tell what. The tension was unbearable, and the silence in the room, broken only by the relentless hum of the security systems, was deafening. Jake's voice cut through the stillness. We're done for, aren't we? This is it. We're dead. No way out. Mark's jaw tightened, his hand gripping his gun tighter than he intended. The last thing he wanted to do was give in to the fear, but Jake's words were starting to ring true. What if there was no escape? What if they were just pawns in a game they didn't understand? But he wouldn't let it end like this, not without a fight. We get out of here. No matter what it takes. We keep moving forward. And Simon? Mark turned to face him. If you can get that system to stop, I'll make sure you get paid. But you need to hurry. Simon nodded grimly, a bead of sweat dripping from his brow. He wasn't looking at Mark anymore, his attention fully on the device in front of him. His fingers slowed, a look of focus replacing the panic in his eyes. He was close. Mark could feel it. And then, just as the countdown flashed to 30 seconds remaining, Simon's device emitted a soft beep, followed by an eerie silence. The countdown froze. For one terrifying second, no one dared to speak. It felt like time itself had stopped. The machines had fallen silent. The tension in the room was so thick, it almost felt like they were suspended in some other reality. Then, without warning, the mechanical voice boomed through the room again. Security lockdown disengaged. Self-destruct sequence halted. All systems returned to normal. For a moment, no one moved. It felt too surreal, like a weight had been lifted off their shoulders, but there was still that buzzing sense of danger in the air. Mark's eyes met Simon's, and the tech expert exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "We made it," Simon said quietly, his voice hoarse with relief. "I stopped it. We're safe." Jake let out a breath of his own, his body slumping with exhaustion. "Holy shit. I thought we were done for." Mark, still processing the moment, glanced at the vault. The blue light was now dimming, as if the object inside was somehow reacting to the change in the environment. It wasn't just a countdown they had been up against. It was a test, a kind of security measure built into the mansion itself. But now that they had stopped the self-destruct, they were left with a bigger question. What was that object in the vault? And why was it hidden in a place so protected? Without thinking, Mark took a step toward the vault. He couldn't let it go, not now. They had risked their lives to uncover it, and now it was time to find out what they had stumbled into. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He reached out and carefully touched the cool, smooth glass of the vault. The object inside was small, glowing faintly, but it felt different, almost alive in its own strange way. Simon and Jake both hesitated, watching Mark as if he was about to make a fatal mistake. "Mark," Simon warned, his voice shaky, "we don't know what that thing does. Don't mess with it." Mark shot Simon a look over his shoulder. "We didn't come this far just to walk away. This is why we're here. This is why everything went wrong. If Musk is hiding something this big, then we need to know what it is. We can't just walk away now." Jake grimaced. "You're crazy. You know that, right? We could still be walking into something we can't understand." But Mark was already looking at the object, his fingers brushing over the smooth glass of the vault door. The glow from inside flickered again, like it was reacting to him. Slowly, the door to the vault began to slide open, the strange blue light intensifying. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath. As the vault door opened completely, the object inside was now fully visible, a metallic sphere, pulsating with an otherworldly light. It was perfectly smooth, devoid of any markings or buttons, almost too perfect for a piece of technology. It didn't belong to this world. Mark's heart raced as he reached forward, his fingers brushing the surface of the sphere. Before he could make contact, the entire room shuddered again, and the lights flickered violently. "Unauthorized access detected. System breach imminent. Activating emergency protocols." The voice was different this time, more urgent, more aggressive. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening. This wasn't just a simple object. It was activating something, and they had no idea what that something was. Jake backed away, eyes wide with fear. "Mark, get away from it." But it was too late. The room began to pulse with an energy they couldn't explain. The lights flickered wildly, the walls vibrating as the blue light from the object intensified. Mark felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, a prickling sensation that ran through his entire body. Then the voice came again, louder, more commanding. "Warning. The prototype has been activated. Containment breach in progress." Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the walls seeming to close in once more. But this time, it wasn't just the security system they had to worry about. They had unlocked something far darker, and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The room was suddenly alive with a sinister hum, louder than anything Mark had ever heard. The strange object in the vault, a metallic sphere, pulsed with an eerie blue light, casting a cold glow that illuminated the room. The walls, once a sterile white, now seemed to distort and bend with the strange energy radiating from the sphere. Mark backed away slowly, feeling a deep unease settle in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't part of the plan. They hadn't come here for some alien tech or some doomsday device. Yet here they were, standing on the edge of something much bigger than any of them could have imagined. "Shit," Jake muttered, stepping backward, eyes wide with panic. "What the hell is happening? I don't like this, man. This is not what we signed up for." Mark's mind was racing. Containment breach in progress? What the hell did that mean? The prototype, whatever it was, wasn't just some priceless object Musk had hidden away in his vault. It was alive, reacting to their presence, and the system had already triggered an emergency protocol. "Get back," Simon hissed, grabbing Mark's arm and yanking him away from the vault. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "That thing's not a toy. It's not even a piece of tech we can comprehend. We need to get the hell out of here." But Mark couldn't move. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor as the sphere continued to pulse, growing more intense with every second. The room felt hotter now, like an invisible pressure was closing in around them, pushing them toward the center of the room. "We can't leave, Simon," Mark said, his voice shaking with a mixture of awe and fear. "Do you see this? Do you see what it's doing? We can't just walk away from this. There's something important here, something Elon Musk has been hiding. We need to know what it is." "You're crazy, Mark," Jake shouted. He was backing up toward the door, his hands shaking. "That thing is going to kill us. We don't even know what it is. Let's get the hell out of here before it's too late." The hum in the room grew louder, more insistent. Mark's heart raced, but he couldn't look away. The object, the prototype, was no longer just a mystery. It was something far darker, something that was activating in response to their presence. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered violently, and the floor beneath them trembled again, as if the mansion itself was alive. Mark's skin prickled with fear, but he refused to turn away. Whatever this was, whatever they had stumbled upon, they couldn't just leave it behind. Not now. Not when it had already triggered the emergency protocols. "We need to figure out what this thing does," Mark said, his voice grim. "We can't just run away from it. Not when we're already this deep in." Simon's eyes were wide with panic. "We don't understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here. That's not a simple gadget. That's not even—" He paused, his voice faltering. "I don't know what it is, Mark, but we need to get out of here now. It's activating something." Mark finally tore his eyes away from the glowing sphere. His gaze met Simon's, and for a split second, he saw the fear in his friend's eyes. The same fear he felt deep down, gnawing at him. Whatever it was too late to walk away from. But then, just as quickly as the lights had flickered, the room suddenly went dark. The blue glow of the sphere was the only source of light now, casting ghostly shadows across the walls. The hum stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt suffocating. The air was thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Mark swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "What just happened?" "I don't know," Simon answered, his voice low, almost fearful. "But something's coming. We need to move now." Before Mark could respond, the ground beneath them shifted. It wasn't a small tremor. It was as if the entire mansion was waking up. The walls shook with force, and the room felt like it was vibrating, pulling them in every direction at once. Mark instinctively grabbed onto a nearby pillar, trying to steady himself. "We're not getting out of here without answers." Mark yelled above the chaos, trying to make himself heard over the growing rumble. "Get to the vault controls now." Simon dashed toward the control panel, his fingers flying over the keyboard as the rumbling continued to increase in intensity. The sound of machinery whirring echoed through the room, and the air was thick with a strange, almost electric charge. Then, a loud metallic hiss echoed, and the vault door slammed shut with an audible thud. "No, no, no!" Jake screamed. "We're locked in. What the hell is going on?" Mark's chest tightened with fear. They were trapped. The vault had sealed itself again, and this time, they weren't just dealing with a few simple security measures. They were up against something that seemed alive, something that was far beyond anything they could have prepared for. Simon looked up at Mark, his face pale, his voice frantic. "I can't get it open. The system's gone haywire. It's locked us in. We can't override it." Jake pounded on the wall. "We're gonna die in here, aren't we?" His voice was raw, full of panic. "We're gonna die because we decided to mess with something we didn't understand." Mark's breath came in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't just about a heist anymore. This wasn't about getting rich or pulling off the perfect job. They were playing with something far more dangerous than anything they could have imagined. But they had no choice. They had to keep going forward, even if it meant uncovering something that could destroy them. Suddenly, a deep voice, mechanical and distorted, boomed through the room. "You have awakened the prototype. You cannot leave. You will serve the purpose for which you have been chosen." The voice sent a chill down Mark's spine. The words felt like a warning, like something ancient had just been awakened. "We're not chosen for anything," Mark growled, his hands clenched into fists. "We didn't sign up for this." But it was too late. The countdown had started again. Warning: the prototype's power is activated. Countdown initiated. Self-destruct in 10 minutes. Mark's mind raced. They had minutes, just minutes, to figure out what the prototype was, why it had been locked away, and how to stop the countdown before it was too late. They weren't just fighting for riches anymore. They were fighting for their lives. And if they couldn't figure this out fast, the mansion, and everything inside it, would be reduced to ashes. The hum of the prototype intensified, as though it was feeding off their fear. The room now filled with an electric tension that made every breath seem labored. The countdown clock glared down at them. 9 minutes, 45 seconds. The message from the voice still echoed in Mark's mind, as if it was warning them not just of the impending destruction, but of something more insidious. "You will serve the purpose for which you have been chosen." "What the hell does that mean?" Jake muttered, his voice tight with panic. He looked at Mark, his face pale, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Mark, we need to get out of here. Now. I don't care what we were after. This is way bigger than us." Mark didn't answer immediately. His mind was working overtime, processing the words of the voice, the sense of dread that had settled over the room. "Chosen." The word kept repeating in his head, as if it had some kind of significance. The way the prototype glowed, the eerie energy in the air. It was as though they had stepped into something far beyond their control, a game with rules they didn't even understand. "Focus, guys," Mark finally said, his voice steady, though his insides were anything but. He forced himself to look away from the object, the strange, pulsating sphere in the vault. There was a sinking feeling in his stomach, the sense that they had just uncovered a much larger puzzle. "We need to figure out what this thing does. Why is it here? Why was it hidden so well?" Simon, his eyes darting around in confusion, managed to tear himself away from the control panel he'd been frantically working on. His hands were still shaking from the pressure of their situation, but there was something else in his eyes, something far more dangerous than just panic. "We don't have time to be guessing about this," he snapped. "We've already activated something that I can't even begin to comprehend. It's reacting to us. We triggered it, Mark, not the other way around." Mark's throat tightened, but he kept his voice firm. "We can't just run. We've already gone too far. We need answers, Simon. You're the tech expert. You need to dig deeper. Find out why this thing's doing what it's doing." Simon hesitated, but nodded. He turned back to the control panel, his fingers dancing over the keys with a sense of urgency. The countdown clock was still ticking relentlessly, and every second felt like it was pulling them deeper into a nightmare. Jake paced restlessly, his eyes darting to the vault every few seconds, as though waiting for it to open up and swallow them whole. "This is it, man. We're done. No one gets out of this alive. That thing's alive. Whatever it is, it's gonna kill us. We don't even know what it wants." But Mark wasn't listening. His mind was focused on one thing. The words that had echoed through the room, the voice that seemed to know too much. Chosen wasn't just a word. It was a directive, a command. Simon, Mark barked. Do you see anything that indicates what this thing is? What kind of tech is it? Why would Musk have it here? Simon's face was tense with concentration as he scanned the control panel's readouts. The screens were filled with unfamiliar code, strings of numbers and letters that looked like gibberish to Mark, but Simon seemed to recognize something. His eyes widened. "Oh God," Simon whispered. I think I know what this is." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? Tell me." Simon didn't answer right away. He ran his hands through his hair, his voice trembling. "It's not just any tech. It's alien. At least, it was designed to be. This prototype was built with the help of resources Musk acquired through a series of secretive deals. He was studying something, some kind of extraterrestrial technology, and this is what they found. They've been experimenting with it. This object is a power source, Mark. A weapon." "A weapon?" Jake interrupted, his voice rising with disbelief. "You're saying that thing is some kind of alien weapon?" Simon nodded slowly, still reading the screens in disbelief. "Yes and no. It's not exactly a weapon in the traditional sense. It's a power generator capable of unimaginable energy output. But it was designed to be triggered, activated by a specific set of coordinates, and then used in a way that could potentially destabilize the entire region. If Musk was trying to reverse engineer this thing, it means he's been sitting on a technology that could change the course of history, and maybe not in a good way." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "So, this is it? We've unleashed something that could end the world if we're not careful?" Simon looked up at him, his face grim. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The weight of Simon's words hit Mark like a ton of bricks. The countdown was still ticking down, the seconds slipping away faster than he could think. If Musk had been using alien tech that could potentially level cities, it was no wonder he kept it hidden so well. And now, it was in their hands, and they had no idea how to control it. Suddenly, the entire room seemed to shift again, as if the mansion itself was reacting to the prototype's presence. The walls vibrated, and the lights flickered once more. The low hum from the sphere grew louder, almost like a heartbeat, reverberating through the air. "Mark," Jake started, his voice trembling. "I don't want to die. We have to stop this thing. Now." Mark turned to Simon, his jaw clenched. "Can we stop it? Can we shut it down before it's too late?" Simon was already typing furiously, sweat dripping from his forehead. His hands were shaking, and for the first time since they had entered the mansion, Mark saw the same look of desperation that he himself felt. I don't know. The system is locked down. It's not just a matter of pressing a button. The entire power grid is linked to the prototype. If we make the wrong move, it'll trigger the explosion. We might make it worse." "Worse?" Jake whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "How the hell could it get worse?" Mark's gut tightened as Simon's words sank in. If they made a mistake, they wouldn't just be destroying Musk's mansion. They'd be destroying themselves and everything in its path. "Guys," Mark began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to trust Simon. Whatever happens next, we have to stay calm and let him work." The countdown clock reached 4 minutes, 30 seconds. Mark's pulse raced. The fate of their lives, and potentially the entire world, rested in Simon's hands. With each second, it was becoming clearer. There was no going back. The prototype wasn't just a hidden treasure. It was the key to something far more dangerous than any of them had realized. And if they couldn't figure out how to stop it, their greed would cost them everything. The countdown clock now flashed ominously. 3 minutes, 15 seconds. Mark's chest tightened as the seconds ticked by. The air in the room had turned stifling, heavy with anticipation and dread. The sphere at the center of the vault hummed louder than before, the energy pulsing like a living thing, feeding off their every movement. "Come on, Simon," Jake barked, his voice quivering with fear. "We don't have time for this. Just turn it off already." Simon, his face ashen with stress, didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the screen, fingers flying across the keys, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm trying," he muttered, his voice tense. But the system's locked down so tight. It's like trying to crack a safe with no combination. Mark's throat felt dry as he glanced over at Simon. Can you override it? Bypass whatever security Musk set up? Simon didn't look up from the screen. It's not just security, Mark. This thing is alive, or at least it responds to certain stimuli. The protocols are designed to prevent anyone from interfering, and they're practically sentient in their complexity. If I make one wrong move, we're all dead. The room seemed to close in on them. The hum of the prototype filled the air, vibrating the walls and the floor beneath their feet. Mark felt as though they were standing at the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss. If Simon couldn't stop it, if they couldn't shut it down, they'd never make it out of this room alive. Suddenly, the voice from the prototype returned, deep and foreboding, filling the vault. Initiating self-defense protocol. Countdown, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. Self-defense protocol? What the hell does that mean? Simon's fingers froze for a moment, and he looked up at Mark with wide, panicked eyes. That means it's about to react. It's going to do something. And if we're still here when it does, we won't stand a chance. The panic in the room was palpable. Jake looked like he might collapse, his face twisted in sheer terror. Why did we do this? Why did we come here? We're not heroes, Mark. We're not meant for this. We're just... Mark grabbed Jake by the shoulders, shaking him slightly. Focus, Jake, he shouted. We've got 2 minutes, 2 minutes to figure this out. Do you want to die here, or do you want to make it out alive? Jake's breathing was shallow, his eyes wide, but he nodded, trying to steady himself. I don't want to die. I just don't want to end up as some kind of experiment for that thing. Mark glanced back at Simon, his voice strained. Can you stop it, Simon? Can you find a way to disarm it? Simon let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the screens. I think I might be able to disable the prototype's core, but it's going to take all of my focus. The failsafe might trigger once I access the deeper layers of the system. There's a chance it could lock us in permanently. We'll be trapped inside with whatever the prototype is capable of. Mark's blood ran cold. Trapped. That word echoed in his mind, mixing with the growing urgency. The seconds were slipping away. They didn't have much longer before the prototype activated its self-defense system, and if that happened, they wouldn't stand a chance. Do it, Mark said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. We don't have any other options. Do what you have to do, Simon. Simon nodded, swallowing hard. He turned back to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys again, entering a series of commands at breakneck speed. The screens flickered, lines of code appearing and disappearing too quickly for Mark to follow. The hum of the prototype grew louder, more frantic, as if sensing the danger approaching. Accessing main system, Simon muttered to himself, his voice almost drowned out by the increasing noise. I'm in, but the core's heavily encrypted. Hold on. The clock ticked down. 1 minute, 30 seconds. Mark took a step forward, his gaze locked on Simon. Hurry, Simon. We don't have much time left. Simon was sweating now, his breath coming in short bursts as he continued to work. The lines of code on the screen blurred as he raced against time. I'm trying to isolate the core's energy grid. If I can cut the flow, I might be able to deactivate it, at least long enough to stop the countdown. The walls shook again, and this time, it wasn't just the prototype's pulse. It was something else. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very structure of the mansion itself. Warning: unauthorized access detected. Termination protocol activated. Countdown: 1 minute, 10 seconds. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It's not going to stop, is it? Simon didn't respond. He was focused, his eyes flicking across the panels faster than Mark could track. He could hear Simon muttering under his breath, each word a prayer for success. Come on, come on, come on. Jake, trembling, leaned against the wall, hands over his ears. We're dead. We're all dead. Mark clenched his fists, trying to steady his racing pulse. There was still hope. As long as Simon was working, as long as there was a chance, they could make it. Simon! Mark yelled, his voice desperate. Is there a way to stop it completely? Simon finally looked up, his eyes wide with exhaustion. But there was something else there, a flicker of hope. I think I've got it. The main power grid is linked to an override command, but it's buried deep within the prototype's core. If I can disable the failsafe, we might just be able to shut it down. The clock was at 30 seconds. Mark's hands clenched tighter. Then do it. Do it now. Simon typed one final string of code and hit enter with a sharp exhale. For a long moment, nothing happened. The countdown continued to tick down, and the air in the room felt suffocatingly still. Mark held his breath, watching Simon's face for any sign of success or failure. Then, the screens went dark. The hum from the prototype suddenly stopped. The room was silent. For a moment, Mark thought they were too late, that they had failed. But then, the countdown froze. The red numbers stopped at midnight. It was over. Simon collapsed into the chair, breathing heavily. I did it, he whispered, his voice weak. It's done. Mark let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He walked over to Simon, placing a hand on his shoulder, his voice soft but urgent. You saved us, man. You really did. Simon looked up at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. We're not out of the woods yet, he said, his voice hoarse. But we've bought ourselves some time. Jake let out a shaky laugh. Time. We just got time. Mark turned toward the vault, his gaze lingering on the now dormant prototype. It was still glowing faintly, but the immediate threat was over. For now. Let's get out of here, Mark said, his voice calm but resolute. We've done what we came for. It's time to go. But as they started to move toward the exit, the prototype began to hum once more, louder this time, like a warning. The real game, it seemed, was only just beginning. The air in the room still felt thick with tension, as if the very walls were aware of the danger that had been temporarily quelled. The prototype, now silent and inert, lay in the center of the vault, its glow dimmed but not gone. Mark's mind raced. They had done it. They had stopped the countdown, disabled the core, but they hadn't escaped yet. The worst part was that the prototype's pulse had stopped only for the moment. Who knew what would happen if anyone found out it was still there? Or worse, what if someone else had already been alerted? All right, Mark said, his voice steady, but there was a fire behind his words. We need to get out of here now. No more messing around. Jake looked over at the vault, his body still trembling, but the relief on his face was unmistakable. You mean, we're actually going to get out of this place alive? Simon, still slumped in the chair, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, clearly exhausted but determined. Not until we're out of here and miles away. Musk might not even know what we've done yet, but someone else might. We've got to assume we're not alone in here. Mark nodded grimly. That's what I'm afraid of. He turned to Simon. Can you still access the security system? We need a way out, and I need to know if there are guards or any other threats around the mansion. Simon groaned and leaned back in his chair, his fingers still twitching with residual energy from the frantic work he had just done. I can access the security system. I think I've triggered a lockdown on all entrances, but I can't say for sure how long that will last. Musk has some serious backup, man. We need to move fast. Jake's eyes went wide. You're telling me we might be locked in here with no way out? What the hell? We've got to trust Simon, Mark said, his voice cold with determination. If we want out, he's our best chance. Right now, we need to think about how to get past Musk's security. That's the only thing standing between us and getting the hell out of here. Simon looked up from the control panel, his face pale but resolute. I'm not sure how much longer we have. The mansion is wired tighter than a damn bank vault. The security system might be locked, but it won't stay down for long. We need to move quickly. The room fell into a heavy silence. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to get out, to flee, to run. But there was something else gnawing at him, something deeper. The prototype. It had been deactivated, yes, but what had they really uncovered? What was Musk really up to? He pushed the thought aside for now. They had to focus on the present. They had to get out before things got even worse. Simon, Mark said, his voice hard with resolve, can you open a path to the garage? I'm betting that's our best shot at getting out of here without triggering more alarms. Simon's fingers hesitated above the control panel. I can try. If I rear out some of the power to the external systems, it might work, but there's a chance I'll trigger a failsafe. If that happens, the whole mansion will go into lockdown, and we won't be able to get out. Jake's voice shook. So you're saying if we try to get out through the garage, we could end up trapped? And there's no other way out? Mark shot him a sharp look. No time for second-guessing, Jake. We've got one shot at this. We make it count. Simon stood, his legs shaky as he made his way back to the control panel. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed in another string of commands. The screens flickered, and the soft hum of the mansion's security systems pulsed faintly in the background. For a long, tense moment, nothing changed. The seconds seemed to stretch into hours. Then, with a sudden beep, the screen shifted and a new map appeared, this time, with the garage highlighted in green. I've opened the security grid to the garage, Simon said, his voice tight with strain. We have a clear path for now, but we need to move fast. The second we're out in the open, they'll notice something's wrong. Mark grabbed his jacket, his pulse quickening. Let's go. They moved quickly, slipping through the dimly lit corridors of the mansion, every footstep feeling louder than the last. Mark's mind raced, focusing on the task ahead. There was no room for hesitation, no space for mistakes. They had come so far, but getting out was just the first hurdle. They still had to figure out what to do with the prototype and the consequences of everything they had uncovered. The closer they got to the garage, the more tense the air seemed to grow. Mark's hand hovered near the gun at his waist, even though he knew there was no guarantee that would help them if they ran into Musk's security forces. But it was better to be prepared than to face an ambush unarmed. Simon led the way, glancing back over his shoulder every few moments. His eyes were wide with a mix of exhaustion and fear. Keep your heads down, he murmured, and stay quiet. The security teams could be anywhere. Jake, still visibly shaken, clenched his fists at his sides. I can't believe this is happening. I thought it was supposed to be easy. In and out. Now we're sneaking through some billionaire's mansion with an alien weapon that could end the world. Mark didn't respond. The tension in the air was suffocating, but he couldn't afford distractions. He just had to get them out. There was no room for doubt. As they turned the corner toward the garage, Simon stopped abruptly. His eyes widened in horror as he looked at the door ahead. No, 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 no. Something's wrong. Mark's stomach twisted. What is it? Simon's face was pale, his lips barely moving as he spoke. It's locked down. The whole garage section is on lockdown. Mark's heart sank. You said we had a clear path. What happened? I don't know, Simon whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't trigger the full lockdown. Someone else did it from the outside. Jake's voice cracked. We're stuck. We're trapped. We can't. But Mark cut him off. He didn't have time for panic. They had already come too far. There's always a way out, he said, his voice cold and steady. We're not giving up. Not now. As the seconds ticked by, Mark's mind raced. They had come this far. He wasn't about to let it all fall apart. But now, the stakes were even higher. Someone had found out. And if they were caught, it was over. The garage door loomed ahead, its imposing metallic surface now a barrier that seemed impossible to overcome. Simon stood frozen in front of the control panel, his face ghostly pale. His hands were trembling so much it was a miracle. He was still able to type the commands to try and override the lockdown. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his breath came in ragged gasps. They had been running on pure adrenaline for too long, and Mark could see it was catching up to all of them. Come on, Simon, Mark urged, trying to mask the rising anxiety in his own voice. We don't have much time. Jake, still shaking, looked nervously at the door, the feeling of being trapped closing in on him. We've been here too long, man. What if they're already coming? What if Musk already knows we're here? Simon shot him a look, his voice strained. I'm trying, but this system is worse than I thought. It's like it's learning from everything we do. Whoever set this up was a damn genius. Mark stepped forward, trying to keep his cool despite the growing dread. The mansion was eerily quiet, but the stillness only seemed to make the tension in the air worse. It felt like every second that passed was a countdown to their inevitable discovery. "Can you get us out or not?" Mark asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Simon's hands hovered over the keys as he scrolled through lines of code. The screen flickered again, and for a moment, Mark thought the system had locked them out completely. But then, a green light flashed. I think I've bypassed the security wall," Simon said, his voice almost shaky with relief. "The garage doors are open, but the system is still fighting me. I don't know how long we have before." Before Simon could finish, a low rumble echoed from the floor beneath them, followed by a soft mechanical hum that seemed to come from all directions. Mark's heart leaped into his throat. The sound was unmistakable. "Move. Now," Mark barked, already pushing Jake toward the door. Simon hesitated for a split second, his fingers still hovering above the control panel. But then he too rushed toward the door, the lights above flickering as they made their way through the final obstacle. They had seconds before everything would come crashing down on them. The garage doors groaned as they began to slowly slide open, revealing a sleek black car on the other side. It was expensive, probably one of Musk's own, but Mark didn't care about the car right now. He cared about the fact that there was finally an opening. "Let's go," Mark shouted, already running toward the vehicle. Jake stumbled behind him, his fear palpable. "You think we're really going to get out of here, Mark? This whole thing's falling apart. What if Musk has already called?" Before Jake could finish, there was a sharp hiss and a loud metallic clank. The entire garage shuddered violently, and the doors slammed shut halfway, blocking their escape. The hum of the security system grew louder, this time accompanied by the unmistakable whine of motors activating. Mark's stomach sank. "We're too late," Simon muttered, his eyes wide with horror. Mark spun around, searching for an exit. His mind raced. He couldn't afford to panic. They had made it this far. There had to be a way out. "Get in the car," Mark ordered, reaching for the door handle. "We're not going down like this." Simon and Jake hesitated, still frozen in place as the seconds ticked away, their faces pale with fear. But Mark didn't wait for them to decide. He pulled open the door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut behind him. "Mark, what are you doing?" Jake shouted from outside the car. "We can't just—" "Get in the damn car, Jake," Mark snapped, his voice louder now. "We don't have time for this." With no other choice, Simon and Jake scrambled into the car. Simon slammed the door shut just as the security alarms around them blared to life. The interior of the car lit up, and Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel. His mind was in overdrive, but his body moved automatically, responding to the situation with a kind of deadly focus. The rumbling of the motors grew louder, and before Mark could even process what was happening, the garage lights flickered again, and a harsh red light bathed the room. The walls began to close in. The garage was on lockdown, and they had only seconds before the whole mansion was shut down completely. "Drive!" Jake screamed. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car rocketed forward with a screech of tires. The force of acceleration threw them back into their seats, but Mark didn't slow down. He couldn't. They had to get out now. The garage door struggled to open, but Mark had enough speed to force it open halfway. They shot through the gap, the car roaring as it sped into the open air. The cool night breeze hit Mark's face as they tore across the estate, but there was no time to enjoy the freedom. Not yet. He glanced over at Simon, whose hands were gripping the dashboard in a white-knuckled grip. "You got a map?" Mark asked quickly. Simon fumbled in the dark, his hands shaking as he pulled up a holographic display. Yeah. Musk's estate is huge. But we can't go out the front gates. They'll be expecting us. We need to cut across the back roads. There's a shortcut through the woods to the west. If we can make it there, we might lose any pursuers." Mark's gaze darted to the rearview mirror, his pulse quickening as he thought he saw a flash of headlights behind them. They were being followed. "I don't think we have a choice," Mark said, his voice low but steady. "Hold on." He swerved sharply to the left, the tires screeching as they veered off the paved road and onto a gravel path that wound through the trees. The car bounced over uneven terrain, but Mark didn't dare slow down. He could hear the pursuing vehicle now, its engines roaring in the distance. "Hold tight," Mark muttered under his breath. Suddenly, Simon gasped. "The road's blocked up ahead. There's no way through." Mark's mind raced. The shortcut was their only chance, but now it was cut off. They needed another way, but there was no time. "We're not stopping," Mark said firmly. "We go through. Stay low and stay fast." He steered the car directly toward the trees, ignoring the warning lights flashing on the dashboard. The sound of crunching branches filled the air as they plowed through the woods, the car bouncing and swerving violently. Every second felt like an eternity. Behind them, the pursuing car was closing in fast. Mark's heart was in his throat. They couldn't keep this up much longer. "Almost there," Simon shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. Mark didn't need to be told twice. With a final burst of speed, he forced the car forward, crashing through the last of the underbrush. The road beyond was clear, and they could see the open highway just ahead. But before they could even catch their breath, a sharp, shrill sound split the air. The unmistakable sound of a high-powered gunshot. The bullet ricocheted off the car, barely missing them. Mark's grip on the wheel tightened. The stakes had just been raised. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The world outside the car seemed to slow as the bullet's path became clear, the sharp crack of gunfire still echoing in their ears. Mark instinctively ducked, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as his mind raced. Whoever was chasing them now wasn't here to just intimidate. They were here to end this. "Did you hear that?" Jake shouted from the back seat, his voice a mix of panic and disbelief. Mark didn't need to answer. He was already slamming his foot down on the accelerator, the car lurching forward, kicking up gravel and dust behind them as they shot down the narrow, winding forest road. The headlights from their pursuers gleamed through the trees like twin beacons of danger. "We're not safe yet," Mark shouted over the roar of the engine. "Hold on." Simon was hunched forward in his seat, his face pale but determined. "We need to get to the highway," he yelled, scanning the darkness for any sign of the road. "Once we hit the main road, we can lose them in traffic." Mark nodded, his mind flicking through every possibility. The trees around them blurred as they sped through the woods. The road ahead was barely visible, the headlights from the pursuing vehicle gaining ground with every passing second. "Keep your eyes peeled," Mark warned. "We don't have time for mistakes." The car's suspension groaned under the strain as they hit a particularly rough patch, the tires skidding briefly before finding purchase again. In the rearview mirror, the other car's headlights flared up, and Mark saw a flash of movement. Someone, or something, hanging out of the window with a rifle aimed straight at them. "Shit," Mark hissed, swerving the car to the right just as a bullet screamed past the side mirror, narrowly missing. "Keep going," Simon urged, his voice tight with fear. "We're almost there." Mark didn't need any more encouragement. He pushed the car even harder, the engine roaring in protest as it tore through the forest with reckless speed. The path ahead started to clear, and Mark could see the faint outline of the highway in the distance, illuminated by distant streetlights. But just as they neared the opening, a loud thud echoed from the back of the car. Another shot. This time, it hit. The rear tire exploded with a deafening pop, throwing the car into a wild spin. Mark cursed as the vehicle slid sideways, the steering wheel jerking out of his hands. For a moment, it felt as though they were losing control entirely. "Hold on," Mark shouted again, his heart racing as the world around them seemed to spin. The car fishtailed out of control, skidding dangerously close to the edge of the forest, before Mark managed to wrench the wheel back in time. The tires squealed as they found the gravel again, but the damage had been done. The rear left tire was shredded, and the car was dragging, slowing down with every second that passed. "We're losing speed," Jake yelled, panic creeping into his voice. "We can't stop here." Mark gritted his teeth, his focus razor-sharp. "We need to make it to the road." With only moments before the pursuing car caught up, Mark swerved the damaged vehicle back onto the straight path leading toward the highway. He pushed the pedal to the metal, forcing the car forward despite the resistance of the shredded tire. They were less than a mile from the main road, but the odds of making it there were growing slimmer by the second. Behind them, the sound of the other car's engine revved louder. The gunfire had stopped for now, but Mark knew it wouldn't be long before the enemy figured out that their target was still alive and kicking. There were no more tricks left to play. It was just them against whoever Musk had sent to clean up the mess they'd created. Come on, come on, Mark muttered under his breath, willing the car to go faster, even as the wheels struggled to keep grip on the gravel. In the rear view, the headlights grew larger again. Mark didn't know how much longer they had before their pursuers caught up, but he couldn't afford to waste time wondering. They had to make it to the highway. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gravel path started to flatten out, the pavement of the highway coming into view like a lifeline. Mark gritted his teeth and swerved hard to the left, aiming straight for the road. The car hit the pavement with a jolt, and for a moment, Mark felt a rush of hope. But it was short-lived. As soon as the car hit the highway, the sound of the pursuing vehicle's engine roared behind them, now closer than ever. Mark's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A black SUV, gleaming in the moonlight, was tailing them relentlessly. The driver's side window was open, and Mark could see a figure with a rifle, aiming at them once again. "Brace yourselves," Mark yelled, his voice laced with urgency. "We need to lose them before they take us out." Simon's face was ashen. "There's a turn up ahead. If we can make it, we can get into the city. The streets will be crowded. We might lose them there." Mark nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a new intensity. "We're not stopping until we're clear." The SUV was right on their tail now, but Mark wasn't about to give up. He pushed the car faster, weaving through the early morning traffic that was just starting to pick up. The city was ahead, and the dense streets were their best shot at evading capture. They zipped past slow-moving vehicles, the tires of their damaged car screeching with every turn. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the SUV followed closely behind, its headlights practically blinding. "Here it is," Simon yelled, pointing to a sharp turn ahead. "If we take it, we can lose them in the gridlock." Mark didn't hesitate. He swerved sharply to the left, the car screeching as the tires fought for traction. The sharp corner sent the car fishtailing again, but this time, they managed to hold it together. The city streets lay ahead, full of potential obstacles, but also a chance at survival. Mark's eyes darted around, searching for the right moment to break free of the SUV's grip. Behind them, the black SUV took the turn with even greater force, its engine roaring as it closed the distance. But Mark had something they didn't: knowledge of the streets. "This is it," Mark muttered, his fingers twitching at the gear shift. He had to outsmart them. He had to be quicker. Without warning, he slammed the car into a narrow alleyway, sending it barreling down the tight space, dodging dumpsters and obstacles. The SUV tried to follow, but it was too big, too bulky to navigate the narrow alley with the same speed. Mark's heart raced as he took sharp corners, the tires screeching as he pushed the limits of what the car could handle. For a moment, it felt like they might actually escape. But then, bam, the unmistakable sound of a crash. A second later, the alley was filled with the roar of an engine as the SUV came screeching into view, its front bumper bent, but it was still coming after them. Mark's blood ran cold. The chase was far from over. The sound of the pursuing SUV was like a constant, oppressive hum in the background, a relentless reminder that their chances of escape were rapidly dwindling. Mark's heart raced as he navigated the narrow alley, the car's tires squealing in protest, but he didn't dare ease off the gas. He had to keep the momentum going. Come on, Mark muttered to himself, sweat trickling down his forehead as he maneuvered around yet another dumpster. The alley was a maze of obstacles, tight turns, and dead ends. But Mark had lived in the city long enough to know it like the back of his hand. He knew the shortcuts, the hidden alleys that could provide him with a split-second advantage. The problem was, the SUV wasn't far behind. "We can't keep this up," Jake shouted from the back seat, his voice full of panic. "They're going to catch us. They're too fast." Simon, his face drawn and pale, leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the narrow path ahead. "Mark, take the next left. There's an old service tunnel we can use. It'll get us out onto the other side of the block." away from the main roads. Mark didn't hesitate. He veered left sharply, almost losing control of the car as the tires fought to grip the wet pavement. The alleyway they were now on was even narrower, the buildings on either side towering above them like silent giants. But Mark knew that this was their best shot. The SUV had already started to gain on them. "Here it is," Simon shouted, pointing ahead. At the end of the alley was a small, rusted door built into the side of a warehouse. It was barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps, but it was there, just as Simon had said. Mark slammed on the brakes and swerved toward the door, the car jerking forward as it crashed through a small metal gate. The sound of screeching metal filled the air as they entered the tunnel, the dim light flickering above them. The car's engine roared as Mark floored the gas pedal again, pushing them deeper into the dark passage. Behind them, the SUV followed relentlessly, its engine growling like a predator closing in on its prey. Mark could hear the thumping of tires against the uneven ground, but he couldn't afford to slow down now. He needed to get to the other side of the tunnel, and fast. "We're almost there," Simon said, his voice urgent. "The exit is just a few hundred yards ahead." But just as they neared the end of the tunnel, disaster struck. The car jerked violently, and the engine sputtered. Mark's heart dropped into his stomach as the car began to lose power. "What the hell is going on?" Mark yelled, frantically looking down at the dashboard. The check engine light blinked ominously, and the car's RPMs were dropping fast. Simon's eyes went wide. "We've got a fuel line leak. It's running out of gas. No, the engine's compromised." Mark cursed under his breath. The worst possible timing. He slammed his fist on the steering wheel, but the car continued to sputter, its forward momentum grinding to a halt. They were only inches from the end of the tunnel, but it felt like miles. "We're stuck," Mark said through clenched teeth, his voice filled with frustration. Come on. Jake was already fumbling for the door handle, panic evident in his eyes. "We need to bail now." "Not yet," Mark snapped, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "We're not giving up now. We're close." But as the car came to a complete stop, the sound of the SUV's engine grew louder, closer. Mark glanced in the rearview mirror. The headlights were now visible at the tunnel's entrance. It was only a matter of time before the SUV would be in range to finish what they'd started. "Mark," Simon said quietly, his voice grim, "we have no choice. We need to get out of here. Fast." Mark cursed again, slamming his fist on the dashboard in frustration. But deep down, he knew Simon was right. There was no time left. "Okay," Mark said, taking a deep breath. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. In an instant, they all threw open their doors and jumped out of the car, running as fast as they could down the rest of the tunnel. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They had no backup plan, no second chances. The sound of the SUV's engine was now deafening, its headlights bearing down on them like a relentless beast. Mark's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. The end of the tunnel was in sight, but so was the danger. "Head for the gate," Simon yelled, pointing toward the rusted metal exit that had been their target all along. They ran harder, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space, their adrenaline pushing them forward as if their lives depended on it, because they did. Just as they reached the gate, a deafening crash filled the tunnel, followed by the screech of grinding metal. The pursuing SUV had crashed into the entrance, its front bumper crumpling on impact. But the driver wasn't about to stop. Go! Mark yelled, his voice hoarse. They made it to the gate, but it was locked. "Damn it!" Jake cursed, pulling at the rusted metal. "It's stuck." Behind them, the SUV's engine roared again as the driver revved the engine, trying to force the car through the blockage. Mark turned to Simon. "Can you get it open?" Mark asked urgently, his eyes scanning the approaching headlights. Simon stepped forward, scanning the rusted lock with a quick look. He pulled something out of his jacket, an old, trusty crowbar that had come in handy more times than Mark cared to admit. "Just cover me," Simon said, his voice low but focused. Mark and Jake stood ready, eyes on the tunnel's entrance as Simon worked quickly, prying at the gate. The sound of the SUV's engine continued to grow louder, and with every passing second, it felt like they were running out of time. Finally, with a final yank, the gate creaked open, just enough for them to slip through. "Let's go," Mark shouted. Without another word, they darted through the opening and into the dark streets beyond, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the chase was far from over. As they ran into the shadows of the city, Mark realized one thing. They had made it out of one trap, but the real danger was just beginning. The people after them weren't going to give up. Not now, not ever. And neither would Mark. "Let's find somewhere to hide," Mark said between heavy breaths. "This isn't over yet." The city streets were alive with the sound of distant traffic, the hum of streetlights casting long shadows against the concrete as Mark, Simon, and Jake ducked into a narrow alleyway. They didn't speak as they ran, only the sound of their footsteps echoing against the buildings around them. Mark's breath was heavy, his mind racing. Every instinct screamed at him to find a way out of the city. The SUV was still on their tail, and the people after them were only getting closer. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, something concrete, something that could give them an edge. Simon, breathing just as heavily, glanced over his shoulder as they moved deeper into the maze of alleys. "We can't keep going like this. They'll eventually catch up, and they know the city better than we do." Mark nodded grimly, his hand tightening on the strap of his bag. He knew Simon was right. They had been lucky so far, but their luck would run out soon. The city, with its crowded streets and busy intersections, was both their refuge and their prison. The pursuit was only going to get more dangerous, and soon they wouldn't be able to outrun it. "Where do we go now?" Jake asked, his voice tense. He was clearly on edge, his eyes darting nervously as if he expected someone to jump out of the shadows at any moment. Mark took a deep breath, trying to force his racing thoughts into some semblance of order. "We need a safe place. Somewhere no one would think to look for us." Simon nodded thoughtfully. "I know a place. It's an old warehouse on the edge of town. It's off the grid. Not many people know about it. We can lay low for a while, regroup, and figure out our next move." Mark looked at him, eyes narrowing. "You sure it's safe?" "As safe as it gets," Simon said, his voice steady. "We'll need to get there fast, though. The longer we stay out here, the more likely they'll catch up." Mark didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." They moved quickly, sticking to the alleys and shadows as much as possible. The streets were starting to fill with people, though not enough to make it feel crowded. It was a quiet night, but even the quiet was unnerving. Every corner they turned, every building they passed, felt like a potential threat. They were exposed, and the sound of the pursuing SUV's engine still echoed in Mark's mind. They had to keep moving. The alleyways grew narrower and darker as they pressed on, the occasional flicker of a neon sign lighting their way. They passed through the back of a convenience store, then a rundown apartment complex, before finally arriving at a hidden street that seemed deserted. Simon led them down a gravel path to an old, weathered building that looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a tall, looming structure, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling off in large chunks. Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they approached. If anyone knew about this place, it would be the people after them. "This is it," Simon said, stopping in front of a large, rusted door. He pulled out a key from his pocket and unlocked the door with a soft click. The heavy door creaked as it swung open, revealing a dark, musty interior. Mark stepped inside first, followed by Simon and Jake, who closed the door behind them. The air inside was thick with dust, and the only light came from the faint glow of a distant street lamp filtering through the cracks in the building's exterior. The place was huge, an open, cavernous space filled with old crates and forgotten machinery. There was an eerie silence, as if the warehouse had been abandoned for decades. Mark's eyes adjusted to the dim light as he took in their surroundings. There was no sign of anyone, no hint that anyone had been here for years. It was perfect for laying low. "This place is better than I expected," Jake said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. Mark nodded, but his mind was still racing. "We're not safe here forever. We need to figure out who's after us and why. They're not just some random criminals. These people know exactly what they're doing." Simon moved further into the building, brushing aside a hanging tarp that led to a small, makeshift office in the back. He motioned for them to follow. I've got some supplies here. Water, food, a few things to help us keep going. But you're right. We need to know what we're up against. As they entered the small office, Simon immediately started rummaging through boxes in the corner. Mark glanced around, taking note of the sparse, utilitarian setup. A small cot in the corner, a few crates stacked high, and a desk cluttered with papers and old tools. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Jake collapsed into a chair, his face still pale. I don't get it. Why would they be after us? What do they want from us? Mark leaned against the desk, rubbing his temple. I don't know yet, but we need to figure it out before they get too close. They'll come looking for us, and we won't be able to hide forever. Simon turned toward them, holding a few bottles of water and some granola bars. I've been thinking the same thing. Whoever is behind this has resources. They know how to track people, how to erase evidence, and how to make sure they don't leave a trail. Mark's mind went back to the mansion. The security, the way everything had been too perfect, too calculated. It had all been a trap, a game to them. And now they were in the crosshairs. We need to get a message out, Mark said suddenly. We need to let someone know what's happening. Someone who can help us fight back. Simon shook his head. It's not that simple. If we go public, they'll be on us even faster. We need to move carefully. Mark sighed, frustration mounting. He hated feeling helpless. But Simon was right. They couldn't go running to the authorities just yet. Whoever was after them had deep connections. The more they made themselves visible, the more danger they'd be in. So what do we do? Jake asked. Mark stood up, his jaw set with determination. We wait. We plan. And when the time's right, we strike. The tension in the room was thick, but there was something else too, a sense of resolve. They'd survived so far, and if they were going to make it out of this alive, they would have to stay one step ahead. And Mark would make sure they did. The hours dragged on in the dark, damp warehouse as Mark, Simon, and Jake huddled in the makeshift office, waiting. The flickering light of a small, old lamp was their only source of illumination. Mark paced back and forth, his mind working overtime, trying to piece together everything that had happened and figure out what came next. We need information, Mark muttered to himself. We need to know who's behind this, and how they found us so fast. Simon sat at the desk, flicking through a stack of old papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. We can't just guess. We have to be methodical. We're dealing with people who don't make mistakes. Whoever is after us, they're playing the long game. Mark stopped pacing, turning to face Simon. But why us? What do they want with us, especially after what happened at Musk's mansion? Simon leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. That's the question. But one thing's for sure. Musk isn't the only target. Whoever's pulling the strings is bigger than all of this. We've stumbled into something way out of our league. Jake, who had been silently watching them from the corner, finally spoke up. What if it's not just about us? What if it's about Musk? You know, all those enemies he has? Could it be revenge or something bigger? Mark turned to him. You might be onto something. It's hard to ignore how quickly they showed up, how precise they were. It's not just a heist gone wrong. This is bigger. Much bigger. Simon stood, pulling his phone from his pocket. I've got a contact who might know something, but we have to be careful. If they're tracking us this closely, we can't afford to make mistakes. Mark nodded. Make the call, Simon. But be smart. We don't need to give away our position. Simon hesitated for a moment before dialing the number. The phone rang once, twice, then someone picked up. Simon? You better have a good reason for calling me, came the gravelly voice on the other end. Jimmy, I need info, Simon said, his voice calm but firm. You owe me one from back in the day. This isn't about business. This is personal. There was a long pause on the line. Mark could hear the faint sound of shifting on the other end. Jimmy was someone Simon had worked with in the past, a fixer of sorts. He was the kind of person who had access to information, connections, and the kind of people who could help. But he was also someone who didn't play by the rules. I don't know what you're involved in, Simon, but I don't ask questions. You got 5 minutes, Jimmy replied, his voice low. What's going on? Simon glanced at Mark, who motioned for him to go ahead. We were involved in something, unexpected. There are people after us. We're talking about heavy hitters, Jimmy. We need to know who we're up against. Who's behind this whole thing? And how do we disappear? Jimmy's voice shifted, a slight edge of caution in his words. You've got no idea what you're dealing with. Whoever's behind this isn't someone you can just run from. They're well-connected, ruthless, and they don't like loose ends. If they're coming for you, you'd better figure out how to disappear fast. Who are they? Mark cut in, stepping closer to the phone. We need names, Jimmy. We need to know who's pulling the strings. There was another long silence on the line. Finally, Jimmy sighed. They go by different names, but the one you need to worry about is the Rook. He's the one calling the shots behind this whole thing. The Rook is not someone you want to cross. If you've been caught in his sights, you're as good as dead unless you can get out of town, fast. Mark felt his stomach tighten. The Rook. He'd heard whispers about him before. Rumors of a shadowy figure, a criminal mastermind with a far-reaching network, but nothing concrete. Until now, the Rook is going to send more people after us. We need to get out, Simon. We need to disappear, and we need a way to hit back, Mark said, his voice steely. You're not listening, Jimmy replied, his tone now colder. There's no hitting back. You're just trying to survive. I don't know what game you're in, but I suggest you get the hell out of the country. The Rook's people have eyes everywhere. If you stay here, they'll find you, no matter what you do. Simon clenched his fists, frustrated. But we need to know where he's hiding, where we can go to hit him where it hurts. We need leverage. There was a soft chuckle from Jimmy. Leverage? The only leverage you've got right now is your life. If you really want to stay alive, you're going to have to start thinking smaller. Go low, go quiet, and get out of his reach. The Rook doesn't play fair, and he's not going to stop until you're all gone. Mark exchanged a look with Simon. This wasn't the news they were hoping for. The Rook wasn't just some rival criminal. He was a ghost, someone with an army of loyal followers, and more than enough resources to hunt them down wherever they went. All right, Simon said, finally breaking the silence. We'll lay low for now, but we need more time. You get us that, Jimmy, and we'll be able to make our next move. Time's not something you get with the Rook, Jimmy warned, his voice fading, but I'll see what I can do. But don't say I didn't warn you. The line went dead, and the phone went silent. Mark stood still, processing what he had just heard. The Rook, he muttered, his voice low with both fear and determination. We're up against a shadow, and it's going to take everything we've got just to survive. Simon stood by the desk, his arms crossed. We've got no choice now but to wait and gather what we can. Jimmy's right, we can't just rush in, but we need a way to fight back. We can't let the Rook control the game. Not anymore. Jake, who had been silent during the conversation, spoke up. If we can't hit back directly, maybe we can outsmart him. We need to figure out his weaknesses, find out where he's vulnerable. Maybe we can use that to our advantage. Mark nodded slowly. Yeah, we need to be smart. And we need to stay one step ahead. The Rook won't see us coming. As they huddled together in the dim light of the warehouse, Mark's mind raced. The Rook was an enigma, a dangerous, elusive figure with endless resources. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, Mark felt a spark of resolve. If the Rook thought he could break them, he was wrong. They would fight back, and they would make sure the Rook paid for every move he made. The heavy silence in the warehouse pressed down on Mark, Simon, and Jake as they sat huddled around the small desk in the dimly lit corner. The conversation with Jimmy had left them shaken, but Mark's resolve had only strengthened. The Rook wasn't just some run-of-the-mill criminal. He was a shadow, a master manipulator, someone who didn't play by the rules. But one thing was certain. If they wanted to survive, they had to adapt. And adapting meant fighting smart, not just hard. Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the dim space around them. The hum of the nearby streetlights outside barely reached them, but it was enough to remind them that they weren't alone. They were just 3 people in a vast city, surrounded by enemies they couldn't yet fully see. We need to make a move, Mark finally said, breaking the silence. We can't sit around here waiting for the Rook to find us. He's too smart, and he's got too many people. We need leverage, something he'll never see coming. Simon stood up, pacing back and forth. I agree, But we have no time to waste. If we're going to strike back, we need to be prepared. We need to learn everything we can about him, his connections, his weaknesses. Jake, who had been fiddling with an old map Simon had found in one of the boxes, suddenly looked up. What if we can't get to him directly? What if we use his people against him? We've already seen how ruthless they are. Maybe we can find someone on the inside, someone who might be willing to turn on him. Mark's eyes narrowed. The idea had merit. If they couldn't get to the Rook himself, maybe they could exploit his network. Find someone who had grown disillusioned with the man who controlled everything from the shadows. That's a possibility, Mark said, but we need to be careful. If we target the wrong person or make one wrong move, it could cost us everything. Simon stopped pacing and turned toward Mark. We also need to consider how much time we've got. They're not going to give us a lot of space to breathe. We can't risk getting caught before we're ready to strike. Mark nodded, his mind turning over the options. They needed to be quick. The longer they waited, the more likely the Rook's network would close in on them. I've got an idea, Mark said, the pieces starting to fall into place. We're going to need someone on the inside. Someone who knows how the Rook's operation works. But to get close to that person, we need a way to draw them out. Something they can't resist. Something that'll make them think they have the upper hand. Simon raised an eyebrow. And how exactly are we going to do that? Mark smiled grimly. We set a trap. Jake looked up from the map, his expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. A trap? You're saying we bait them into coming after us? Mark leaned forward, his voice steady. Exactly. We give them something they want. Something they think they can use against us. But in reality, we'll be using them to get the information we need to take down the Rook. We make them believe they're the ones in control. But in the end, we pull the strings. Simon's eyes narrowed as he considered the plan. It's risky. If we do it wrong, we could be walking right into their hands. Mark's gaze hardened. We don't have a choice. We can't stay in hiding forever. And if we wait until we're ready, the Rook will find us first. We have to make the move before they do. There was a long pause as Simon and Jake exchanged looks. Finally, Simon spoke. All right, but we need to make sure we're not being too obvious. We can't afford to tip them off. We need to move fast, and we need to move smart. Mark stood up, his voice low but resolute. We'll be careful, but this is our chance. We get this right, and we're one step closer to taking down the Rook. The plan was set. It was a risky move, but they didn't have time to play it safe. They would set a trap, baiting the Rook's network into thinking they were vulnerable, then turn the tables when they least expected it. The next few hours were spent gathering what little they had left, basic supplies, a few tools, and the weapons Simon had managed to procure over the years. They couldn't afford to be caught unprepared. Every step they took now could either lead to their survival or their destruction. As the night wore on, Mark could feel the weight of their plans settling in. They were about to make a dangerous move, one that could change everything. But in this game, there were no safe moves. Only the ones you made with conviction. Let's do this, Mark said, his voice steady. We're not waiting any longer. The next day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Mark and Simon made their move. They had carefully selected their bait, a small-time criminal who had crossed paths with the Rook's people in the past. This man, Charlie, had worked as a go-between for several shady deals. He wasn't connected enough to be a real threat, but he was connected enough to have information that could lead them to the Rook's inner circle. They knew Charlie wouldn't come to them willingly. He was too smart for that. So, they would give him a reason to seek them out. They would use the information they had gathered about a recent deal involving Musk's mansion, something Charlie would find irresistible. The plan was simple, too simple, in fact. Mark had always believed that the best plans were the ones that felt obvious. It was when you started overthinking things that you made mistakes. And right now, they couldn't afford to make any. Mark and Simon staked out a small, nondescript cafe in the heart of the city, a place where Charlie was known to frequent. They sat in a corner booth, eyes scanning the room, watching for any signs of their target. The minutes dragged on. Time was a precious commodity now, and every second felt like an eternity. Finally, just as Mark was beginning to think the whole thing had been a waste of time, the door to the cafe opened. A man in a worn leather jacket stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mark and Simon. It was Charlie. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the door as if he might turn and leave. But then, something in the way Mark sat, calm, confident, ready, must have reassured him. Charlie walked over to the booth, sliding into the seat across from Mark. "You're late," Mark said, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "But I'm sure you have a good reason." Charlie didn't respond immediately. He just studied Mark, as though trying to figure out if this was a trap, or if it was something more. Finally, he spoke. "You're the ones after the rook, right?" Mark's eyes never left Charlie's. "We are, and we think you can help us." Charlie let out a short laugh, leaning back in his seat. "Help you? With the rook? That's a death sentence." Mark's gaze hardened. "Not if you're on the right side of this. We can offer you something the rook can't. A way out." For the first time, Charlie looked interested. "A way out? You think you can take him down?" Mark's voice was low and certain. "We can, but we need your help to do it." Charlie studied him for another long moment before nodding. "All right, I'm listening." This was it. The trap was set, and now they just had to make sure it closed. Charlie's eyes flickered with caution, but the lure of survival and the promise of getting out from under the rook's thumb made his posture relax slightly. He wasn't stupid. He knew when he was looking at a chance, no matter how dangerous it might be. "You're asking me to turn on the rook?" Charlie leaned in, lowering his voice. "That's a one-way ticket to hell, my friend." Mark met his gaze steadily. "We're not asking you to go up against him alone. We're asking for information. The kind of intel that'll give us leverage. We know you've worked with him, and we know you're not his biggest fan." Charlie gave a dry chuckle, running a hand over his stubbled chin. "You know too much, don't you? Everyone's got a breaking point with the rook, and mine came when he tried to make me his pawn. But I'm still breathing, which means I'm not dumb enough to walk into a trap." Simon, who had been silently observing from the corner of the booth, shifted slightly. His hand was close to the small weapon he'd brought for personal protection, but he remained calm. Mark was doing the talking, and Simon knew that Mark had a way of making people listen when it mattered. "We're not here to kill you, Charlie," Mark said in a low, measured tone. "We're here because we need a way to beat him at his own game, and we're offering you a chance to survive. We've got resources, connections, and enough information to put the rook down, but we can't do it without your help." Charlie hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he considered the offer. There was always risk involved in crossing the rook. He'd seen people who'd tried, and they were never seen again. But there was something in Mark's eyes, something that suggested this wasn't just another desperate attempt to take down the boss. There was a fire in Mark's determination, something that made Charlie second-guess the certainty of his fears. "All right," Charlie said, leaning back in his chair, his voice quiet but firm. "What do you want to know?" Mark glanced at Simon before turning back to Charlie. "We need details. The rook's operations, who he's working with, what he's planning next. We need to know his weaknesses. You've been close enough to see things others haven't." Charlie let out a sigh, his eyes now distant, as if he was mentally flipping through pages of his past dealings with the rook. The rook doesn't trust anyone completely, but if you've been around him long enough, you can start to see cracks. He's got a lot of people under his thumb, but not all of them are loyal, and he doesn't like loose ends. Simon's eyes flickered. "Loose ends? What do you mean?" Charlie leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "People who know too much. People who get too close. The rook deals with them in ways that don't always make sense. Sometimes, he just disappears them. Sometimes, he turns them into assets. His eyes, his ears." Mark pressed him further. "And who would be considered a loose end right now?" Charlie paused, his face shadowed with uncertainty. "There's a guy, a hacker, goes by the name Echo. He was working on something big for the rook, something with the mansion job, but he didn't deliver exactly what the rook wanted. Now, Echo's on the run. I've heard the rook is hunting him down personally." Simon's eyes lit up. "A hacker? That's a start. If we can find him, we might be able to use him to our advantage." Charlie gave a small shrug. "Maybe, but Echo's got his own agenda, and he's not easy to track. He knows how to cover his tracks. If you're planning on using him, You better be ready to move fast. He's not someone you catch by asking nicely. Mark nodded. That's exactly what we plan to do. We'll find him, and when we do, we'll make sure the rook doesn't. Charlie leaned back again, looking more relaxed than before, but his eyes remained wary. You're playing a dangerous game, you know? The rook doesn't just control people. He controls information. If he figures out what you're up to, you'll be dead before you can blink. Mark met his gaze, his voice calm. We're not going after him head-on. Not yet. First, we need to find Echo and figure out what he knows. If the rook is really after him, then he's a key piece in all of this. Charlie nodded slowly, then looked down at his coffee cup. I've got a contact who might know where Echo is hiding. He's someone who keeps his ear to the ground when it comes to people like us. I'll get you the information, but it'll cost you. Mark didn't flinch. Name your price. Charlie's eyes twinkled with the knowledge of his leverage. I want protection. The rook won't forget I helped you. And when he comes looking for me, I'll need somewhere to go. Mark exchanged a look with Simon. This was the part of the plan they'd been expecting. Everyone had a price, and in their current situation, they didn't have the luxury of playing hardball. Mark nodded. We'll make sure you're safe, Charlie. But don't think this means we trust you completely. You're still walking on thin ice. Charlie smiled, a wicked grin that seemed almost genuine. I wouldn't expect anything less. The next few hours passed in a blur. Charlie kept his word and made a few phone calls, pulling strings that Mark and Simon could only hope would lead to Echo. The hacker wasn't exactly easy to find. He'd gone off the grid completely after his failure with the rook. But if Charlie's contact was right, there was a small chance they could catch up with him before the rook's people did. Mark and Simon left the cafe, their heads buzzing with the possibility that they were closer to finding the missing piece of the puzzle. They knew that finding Echo wouldn't be the endgame. It was only the beginning, but it was a crucial step toward taking down the rook. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the streets were starting to empty out as the evening settled in. Mark and Simon walked side by side, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, aware that the rook's people could be anywhere. We're closer, Simon said, his voice low. But we're not out of the woods yet. Mark nodded, his mind racing. No, but we're not going to wait around for the rook to find us. We're going to find Echo first. They had one chance to make it right, and this time, they wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating their enemy. The game had changed, and now, they were in control. As the night deepened, the phone rang. Charlie's contact had come through. I've got a lead, Mark said, his voice tense with anticipation. Echo's hiding out in an abandoned warehouse near the docks. But we need to move fast. The rook's men are already closing in. Simon's hand instinctively went to the small weapon at his side. Let's go. We can't afford to waste time. It was time to put their plan into action. The trap was about to close on the rook, but only if they could get to Echo first. The air at the docks was thick with salt and the faint scent of gasoline. Mark and Simon moved in the shadows, blending into the night as best they could, their footsteps muffled by the damp concrete beneath their boots. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, its bright lights mocking the quiet desperation that now filled the air between them. Echo's got to be in there, Mark muttered, glancing at Simon. This is the place. I can feel it. Simon nodded, his eyes scanning the empty streets. The only sound was the distant hum of shipping containers being moved and the occasional creak of an old dockside crane. The warehouse stood in the middle of a collection of abandoned structures, its windows boarded up and the doors slightly ajar, as if someone had just recently passed through. Charlie's contact said Echo's been hiding here for days, Simon said, his voice low. But that doesn't mean he's alone. If the rook's men are closing in, we need to be prepared for anything. Mark didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing. Echo could be their key to unlocking the rook's operation. If they could get the hacker to talk, it might be their only chance to find the rook before the rook found them. They reached the door, and Mark gently pushed it open, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The darkness inside was suffocating, but they had no choice but to push forward. Stay sharp, Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. The air inside the warehouse was stale, the kind of heavy air that suggested something had been abandoned for a long time. The faint smell of rust and old wood filled their nostrils, as they moved deeper into the shadows. There was no sign of life, no movement in the corners, no distant voices. It felt almost too quiet. They navigated through stacks of crates and old, rusted equipment, keeping their backs to the walls. Mark's pulse quickened with each step, the tension growing tighter as they moved further into the heart of the warehouse. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "Who's there?" Mark froze, and Simon's hand instinctively went to his weapon. The voice was calm, almost too calm, as though the person speaking had been waiting for them. "I'm not here to hurt you," Mark called into the darkness, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We're looking for Echo." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, tall, thin, with shaggy hair and a wary, guarded expression. It was him. "Echo." "You found me," Echo said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He didn't seem surprised, but he definitely wasn't pleased. "Took you long enough." Mark took a cautious step forward. "We don't have much time. The Rook's men are coming for you." Echo raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "And why should I trust you? You think I'm just going to walk out of here with you? What's in it for me?" Simon stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "You get to live. That's what's in it for you." Echo considered this, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the side of an old crate. After a long pause, he spoke again. "You want to take down the Rook. I get it. But that's not a small task. The man doesn't just let people walk away. If you're planning on taking him on, you better be ready for war." Mark nodded. "We know. That's why we need you. We need the information you have. Everything you know about him, his plans, his connections. You're the key to bringing him down." Echo leaned against the crate, studying Mark carefully. "You think you can beat him? You think you're strong enough to stand up to the Rook?" Mark's voice hardened, his confidence clear. "I've got nothing to lose. And neither do you." There was a flicker of something in Echo's eyes, something that could have been recognition, or maybe it was just a reflection of his own desperation. He finally sighed, stepping away from the crate and moving toward the center of the warehouse. His voice was softer now, resigned. "All right," Echo said. "I'll tell you what I know. But it's not going to be pretty. The Rook's network is vast, and he doesn't leave loose ends. If you want to take him down, you're going to have to play his game. And you'll need more than just information to survive." Mark and Simon exchanged a glance. They didn't have the luxury of being picky. They needed every advantage they could get, and Echo's knowledge was their best shot. "We're listening," Mark said. Echo looked around the warehouse one last time, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. The Rook controls everything, from the underground networks to the top tech companies. He's got connections in law enforcement, politics, the media, and he's always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. He keeps a tight circle, but if you know where to look, there are cracks in the system. I've been digging through his files for months, trying to figure out a way to take him down from the inside. But I couldn't get far. He has layers of protection, layers that even I couldn't crack." Simon stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "So what do we do? How do we get to him?" Echo met Simon's gaze, his face grim. "You find the people he trusts. People he thinks are loyal. You start there. If you get close to the right person, you might be able to gain enough trust to access his inner circle. But it's a dangerous game. One wrong move, and you're done." Mark's mind was racing. This was bigger than they'd anticipated. The Rook wasn't just some street-level criminal. He was a kingpin with vast resources at his disposal. And Echo's words confirmed what they'd suspected all along. If they were going to beat the Rook, they needed more than just brute force. They needed strategy. They needed information. "And what about you?" Mark asked, his voice quiet. "What happens to you now?" Echo gave a short, hollow laugh. "Doesn't matter. I'm already marked. The Rook doesn't let traitors go free. But you might still have a chance. If you can pull this off, maybe you can end his reign of terror. Just be careful. He's got eyes everywhere." Before Mark could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance of the warehouse. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The Rook's men had found them. "Get down," Mark hissed, grabbing Echo and pulling him behind the nearest stack of crates. Simon's hand was already on his weapon. They couldn't afford to be caught now, Not after everything they'd risked to get this far. They had one chance to make it out alive. "Stay low," Mark whispered, his voice tight with urgency. The footsteps drew closer, and Mark's eyes scanned the dimly lit warehouse for a way out. He knew they had to act fast, before they were surrounded. The men entered the warehouse, their movements quick and confident. They were here for Echo, and they weren't going to leave without him. Mark's breath caught in his throat as the first man passed by their hiding spot. The faint rustling of fabric was the only sound that marked their presence. They were dangerously close now, and the tension was unbearable. Simon slowly reached for his gun, his grip tight. "On my mark," Mark whispered. They had only one chance to take these men down. If they didn't act fast, they'd be fighting for their lives, and they didn't plan to lose. Mark's pulse was pounding in his ears. Every muscle in his body screamed to move, to act, but he held himself still, knowing the slightest sound could give them away. The men walked past, their boots echoing in the silence, unaware that the three of them were crouched just a few feet away. Simon's hand hovered over his weapon, his eyes sharp, scanning every inch of the room. Mark's mind was racing. They had to take the men down before they got too close to Echo. If they didn't, they could kiss any chance of getting out of here alive goodbye. The footsteps were getting closer to the center of the warehouse. Mark made a quick decision. It was now or never. "Now!" he hissed, and in an instant, Simon was on his feet, weapon drawn. He moved with precision, disarming the first man before he even had time to react. The second man spun around, but Simon was already behind him, a swift jab to the neck, sending him to the ground in a heap. Mark didn't wait. He lunged at the third man, tackling him to the floor, his hands closing around the man's throat in a vice grip. The fight was over in seconds. As the last man went limp, Mark looked at Simon, his eyes wide with adrenaline. "We don't have much time. There are more coming." Echo, still crouched behind the crates, was watching them with a mix of disbelief and awe. "That was impressive. You sure you're not mercenaries?" "Not yet," Mark said, wiping sweat from his brow as he pulled himself to his feet. "But we could be if we survive this. We've got to get out of here before more of his men show up," Simon said, his voice tense. He looked toward the entrance, eyes darting back and forth. "We need an exit plan now." Mark scanned the warehouse, his mind working overtime. There had to be another way out, something they could use to slip past the growing number of Rook's men. "There's a back door," Echo said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It leads to a smaller alleyway. If you can get to it without being spotted, you'll be able to slip out. But you've got to move fast." Mark didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." Echo nodded, rising to his feet, his movements swift but cautious. He moved toward the far end of the warehouse, where a small metal door sat half-hidden behind a stack of old crates. Mark and Simon followed closely behind, keeping their movements as quiet as possible. The sound of footsteps grew louder again, signaling that more of the Rook's men were drawing near. The clock was ticking, and the air was thick with tension. They reached the door. Echo pushed it open just a crack, peering out into the darkness of the alley. "It's clear for now," he whispered, "but that won't last." Mark motioned for Simon to go first. "We'll cover you." Simon nodded and moved quickly, slipping through the door with the fluidity of someone who had spent far too much time in dangerous situations. Mark followed close behind, but as he stepped into the alley, a sharp noise rang out from the warehouse behind them. "Damn it," Mark muttered, spinning around. The men they'd taken down were starting to stir. "We're not out of the woods yet. Move." Echo took off running, leading them through the narrow alleyways, his footsteps silent and calculated. Mark and Simon kept their pace, both men fully aware of the danger they were still in. They had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead. They rounded a corner, and Echo stopped abruptly. "There's a van waiting just up ahead. It'll get us out of here." The three of them sprinted toward the van, their breaths coming in short bursts, their bodies pushed to the limit. Mark's mind raced, focusing on the mission, but he couldn't shake the thought that they had narrowly escaped death just moments ago. They were running out of time, and out of options. As they reached the van, the driver, a nondescript figure with a baseball cap pulled low, threw open the side door. "Get in. Now." They didn't hesitate. Simon and Mark piled into the back, with Echo following closely behind. The van's engine roared to life as they sped away, the streets blurring past them. For a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of tires on pavement and the rush of air in their ears. Mark looked out the back window, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. He couldn't let his guard down, not now. "We're not safe yet," Simon said, his voice low, but urgent. "Rook's men will be looking for us. They'll be combing the streets, checking every alley. We need to get underground." Echo didn't respond immediately. He was staring out the front window, lost in thought. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "I know a place. It's a safe house. It's not far from here. We can lay low there for a while, figure out our next move." Mark glanced at Simon, who nodded. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. "Take us there," Mark said, his voice firm. "We'll regroup, and then we move forward." The driver made a sharp turn, and the van plunged into a darker part of the city. The streets grew quieter, the buildings more dilapidated. Mark felt the weight of the situation settle over him. They had just made it out alive, but the real fight was only beginning. The Rook wasn't going to stop until they were all dead. And Mark knew that in this game, it was kill or be killed. They weren't safe yet, not by a long shot. As they pulled up to the safe house, a small, unmarked building tucked between two larger structures, Mark's mind was already turning, plotting their next move. Echo had told them everything he knew, but Mark wasn't ready to trust him completely just yet. There was too much at stake. They needed to find the Rook, and they needed to do it quickly. But first, they needed to survive the night. The van stopped, and Echo quickly led them inside. The place was sparsely furnished, the kind of place that felt like it could disappear off the map without a trace. "Stay here for now," Echo said, shutting the door behind them. "I'll keep an eye out." Mark nodded. They'd have to lay low, keep their heads down, and hope that they could stay one step ahead of the Rook's men. But as Mark sank into a chair, his eyes fixed on the door, a single thought echoed in his mind. The game was about to get a lot more dangerous. The safe house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Mark sat on the edge of a worn armchair, staring at the map of the city that had been hastily pinned to the wall. It was covered with red circles, each one marking a location of interest: warehouses, potential hideouts, known contacts, and, most importantly, the places where the Rook's influence was strongest. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had escaped, but for how long? The Rook had resources, and he wasn't known for his patience. If they didn't find a way to neutralize him soon, their brief victory would be short-lived. Simon was pacing, his eyes darting to the windows every few seconds, scanning the street outside. Echo's not wrong. Rook's men will be looking for us. They'll hit the streets first, then start hitting our contacts. We need to stay off their radar until we've got a better plan. Mark nodded, barely listening. His mind was elsewhere. He had 100 thoughts running through his head, all tangled together. Echo had given them some useful information, but it wasn't enough. They still didn't know where the Rook was operating out of, his main base of operations, and without that, they were stumbling in the dark. Echo had disappeared into the back room of the safe house as soon as they arrived, leaving them alone with their thoughts. The hacker had seemed distant, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Echo wasn't telling them everything. But now wasn't the time to question him. "All right," Mark said, breaking the silence. He stood up and walked over to the map. "We know the Rook has layers of protection. We can't just walk into his headquarters without getting ourselves killed. We need intel, more than what Echo gave us." Simon stopped pacing and turned to face him. "How do you suggest we get that? Echo's our only lead right now." Mark tapped his finger on the map, tracing a line between several of the marked locations. "We hit these places. We gather intel from his associates, get close to his inner circle. The Rook's network is vast. If we go after the smaller players, we might be able to get something big." Simon raised an eyebrow. "And you think these people are going to talk? They're loyal to him for a reason." "They're loyal because they're scared," Mark replied, his voice low but determined. "But fear can be turned. We need to make them see that it's either us or the Rook. And if they don't talk, well, We'll make sure they don't become a problem. Simon's eyes narrowed. You're talking about getting your hands dirty. Mark met his gaze. There's no other way. We don't have time for subtlety. We don't have the luxury of playing by the rules anymore. If we want to stop the Rook, we need to hit him where it hurts. Simon took a deep breath, considering Mark's words. After a long pause, he nodded. All right, let's do it. But we'll need a plan. We can't afford to make any mistakes. Mark nodded. We'll start small. I've marked a few of his lesser-known operations on the map, places where we might be able to grab someone who knows something. Then we can work our way up. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more likely it is that the Rook will find us. At that moment, Echo reappeared, his face slightly pale, a grim look in his eyes. He had been quiet for too long, and Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. You've got a plan? Echo asked, his voice laced with skepticism. You really think this will work? Mark turned to face him, the edge of impatience creeping into his tone. We don't have much of a choice, do we? We need information, and we need it now. You said it yourself, the Rook's network is vast. The longer we wait, the more ground we lose. Echo hesitated, as if weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and dropped into a chair at the small table in the center of the room. All right, I'll help you, but you're not going to like what you find. The Rook has eyes everywhere. He's always watching. Mark's eyes hardened. I don't care. We're not backing down. We'll take whatever we find and use it. Echo didn't say anything in response. Instead, he pulled out a small laptop from his bag, setting it on the table. He started typing quickly, his fingers flying over the keys with practiced speed. Mark and Simon watched, each of them tense, waiting for any new information. After what felt like an eternity, Echo looked up from the screen. I've got something. A lead. There's a shipment coming in tonight, a big one. I can't tell you exactly what's in it, but it's enough to draw attention. The Rook will be there personally, which means his men will be distracted. If you go now, you might have a chance to get inside and gather information. Mark's heart skipped a beat. This was the opportunity they needed. A shipment? Simon asked, his voice cautious. What kind of shipment? Echo didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the screen, his brow furrowed. I'm not sure, but I've been tracking this one for a while. It's being handled by one of the Rook's lieutenants. His name's Lucas. If you can find him, you'll find the answers you're looking for. Mark's eyes narrowed. Lucas. He had heard the name before. A shadowy figure in the Rook's network, known for being cold and calculating. If Lucas was involved, it meant this wasn't just a simple shipment. It could be a weapon, tech, or something even more dangerous. This could be our break, Mark said, his voice steady but urgent. We hit this shipment tonight. If we can get close to Lucas, we can find out what the Rook is really up to. Echo nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Just remember, the Rook won't let anyone near his operation without a fight. Be prepared for anything. Mark turned to Simon, who gave him a curt nod. We'll be ready, Simon said. With the plan set, they gathered their gear, the tension in the room palpable as they prepared to leave. They didn't have time to waste. The shipment was their only shot at getting the upper hand on the Rook, and they had to move fast. As they exited the safe house, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the heart of the storm. But he didn't have a choice. There was no turning back now. The Rook had made his move, and now it was time for them to make theirs. They climbed into a nondescript car that had been parked outside the safe house, and the driver, a contact from Echo's network, pulled away from the curb. Mark's mind was focused, his thoughts sharp and clear. But beneath that, a sense of dread gnawed at him. Every step they took seemed to lead them closer to the Rook's lair. As they drove toward the location of the shipment, Mark glanced at Simon. The two of them shared a silent understanding. There was no going back from this. They were in this until the end, and they were about to discover just how far the Rook would go to protect his empire. The streets were eerily quiet as the car made its way through the city. Mark's eyes darted over the darkened buildings, his mind racing with possibilities. Everything felt like a prelude to something big, a confrontation that was going to change everything. He couldn't afford to make a mistake, not now, not when they were this close. The driver, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, navigated the narrow roads with ease. His silence was as thick as the tension in the air. Echo, sitting in the front passenger seat, glanced back at Mark and Simon, his face drawn and serious. "We're almost there," Echo said quietly, tapping a finger on the dashboard. "This is the most secure site the Rook operates. Lucas will be there, surrounded by his men. You can't trust anyone." Mark nodded, tightening his grip on the seat. He wasn't sure if he was more afraid of what was waiting at the warehouse or what they would find if they managed to get inside. Either way, it felt like they were walking into the lion's den. The car turned onto a long, empty street, lined with tall, foreboding buildings. The warehouse they were headed towards sat at the end of the street, dark and almost indistinguishable from the others, save for the heavy security surrounding it. Guards stood at the entrances, their eyes scanning the surroundings, looking for any sign of trouble. "They're expecting a shipment, so this should be our window," Echo continued, leaning forward to lower his voice. "Once inside, stick to the shadows. The less attention we draw, the better." Mark shot a look at Simon, who nodded silently. "We go in fast, get the intel, and get out. No heroes." "Got it," Mark said, exhaling slowly. There was no room for error. The car slowed to a stop several blocks away from the warehouse. Echo and the driver exchanged a brief look before they both climbed out, leaving Mark and Simon alone in the back seat. Echo walked toward a side alley, where a secondary entrance to the warehouse was located. Mark and Simon followed closely behind, blending into the shadows, trying to avoid detection. They reached the back of the warehouse, where Echo was already waiting by a small, unguarded door. It was a low-level entry, typically used for employees or shipments arriving on foot. Echo motioned for them to stay low. "Once we're in, we'll need to separate," he whispered. "You two go right, I'll take the left. Look for anything that might tell us what's in that shipment. But be quick, Lucas won't be distracted for long." Mark gave a terse nod. His mind was already running through their options, weighing the risks. There were no guarantees they'd make it out alive, but this was their best shot. Echo quickly unlocked the door with a small tool from his bag. The door creaked open, and the three of them slipped inside, immediately greeted by the smell of metal and old wood. They were in a dimly lit hallway that led into the main area of the warehouse. Mark's senses were on high alert as they moved deeper into the warehouse. They passed rows of stacked crates and pallets, each one potentially holding something valuable or dangerous. Mark's eyes flickered from one shadowed corner to another, but there was no sign of movement. Echo led them to a narrow hallway that branched off the main floor. A door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, revealing the faintest sliver of light. They crept closer, hearing low voices coming from the room beyond. Mark exchanged a glance with Simon before they both moved forward, quiet as ghosts. As they approached the door, Mark signaled for them to stop. He strained to listen, his heart pounding in his chest. "Shipments arriving soon. Make sure everything's secure. I don't want anyone slipping through the cracks," a deep voice growled. Mark immediately recognized it as Lucas. "He's here," Mark whispered, glancing over his shoulder at Simon. Simon gave him a quick nod. "Let's move." They pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was large, filled with crates and barrels that had been stacked with meticulous precision. Several armed men stood guard, their attention focused on the incoming shipment. Lucas, a tall man with short-cropped dark hair, was pacing near a control panel, speaking to someone on the phone. "This is it," Mark whispered. He motioned for Simon to cover the right side of the room while he took the left. They moved in quickly, staying low, using the crates for cover. Mark's eyes scanned the room, looking for anything that could tell them what the Rook was really up to. At the far end of the room, a large crate sat open. Inside was a strange assortment of equipment, computers, tech hardware, and something that resembled a weapon case. Mark's instincts flared. This wasn't just a simple shipment. This was bigger. Mark started to move closer, but a sound caught his attention. Footsteps. Rapid. Too fast. He turned just as one of Lucas's men rounded the corner, his eyes locking onto Mark's. Time slowed. The man's hand shot out for his gun, but Mark was faster. He dove forward, using his shoulder to knock the man off balance. They both tumbled to the ground, but Mark managed to get on top, his hands closing around the man's neck. A quick squeeze, and the man went still. Simon moved into position beside him, his gun drawn, but he didn't fire. There were too many guards in the room to risk alerting the others. "Good shot," Simon muttered under his breath, but Mark didn't have time for compliments. He pulled the man's body behind a nearby stack of crates, out of sight. "We need to get to Lucas," Mark said, his voice urgent. They moved again, edging closer to the man in charge. Lucas hadn't noticed their approach yet, his back turned as he continued his phone conversation. Mark wasn't taking any chances. He signaled to Simon, who nodded and moved to the other side of the room, positioning himself in the perfect spot to cover Mark. Mark slowly crept up behind Lucas, staying as quiet as possible. Just as he reached the man's side, Lucas turned, spotting him. "Who the hell are?" Before Lucas could finish his sentence, Mark tackled him to the ground. The two men struggled, but Mark's training and raw strength gave him the advantage. He punched Lucas hard in the face, knocking him out cold. "Get the intel," Mark ordered, panting as he stood over the unconscious man. Simon quickly moved to Lucas's pockets, pulling out a small device, a phone, most likely. He swiped through it, his eyes flicking over the screen. "I've got something," Simon said. "A list of locations, Rook's facilities, and a timetable for shipments. This is exactly what we need." Mark nodded. "Let's get out of here." They moved quickly, avoiding the rest of the guards and slipping back through the hallways. As they neared the exit, Mark could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. They were close. Simon pulled the door open, and they slipped into the night, disappearing into the shadows just as the first guards entered the warehouse. They ran, adrenaline fueling their every step. They weren't safe yet, but they had the information they needed. The Rook wouldn't see them coming. The adrenaline from the raid was still coursing through Mark's veins as he and Simon sprinted down the alley, their footsteps echoing off the cold concrete. The dim glow of the streetlights barely illuminated their path, but they kept moving, not daring to slow down. They had what they came for, the intel. It was their ticket to taking down the Rook. Behind them, the sound of shouts and footsteps grew fainter, but Mark knew they couldn't afford to relax yet. The guards wouldn't stop searching, not until they had tracked down every single intruder in that warehouse. Echo was waiting by the car, his eyes scanning the shadows as they approached. Without a word, he threw open the back door, and Mark and Simon jumped in. The car engine roared to life, and they sped off, leaving the chaos of the warehouse behind them. "You get what you needed?" Echo asked, glancing over his shoulder at Mark. Mark didn't hesitate. "We did. It's all here," he said, tapping the small device that Simon was holding. "A list of locations. And a timetable. We've got enough to hit Rook where it counts." Echo nodded, but there was something off about his expression. He looked tense, more so than usual. "Good. But we're not out of the woods yet. The Rook won't let us go this easily." "Yeah, no kidding," Simon muttered. "But we've got the upper hand now. We've got his secrets. He'll be the one on the defensive for a change." Mark sat back in his seat, his mind working. He kept replaying the scene in the warehouse. The way Lucas had fought, the way they'd barely made it out. They couldn't afford another close call. The Rook wasn't someone who made mistakes, and he wouldn't hesitate to retaliate. This was about more than just stopping him. It was about survival. The car sped through the streets, the city lights blurring as they raced towards their next destination. Mark knew they needed to lay low for a while, plan their next move carefully. The Rook wasn't going to give up his empire without a fight. But with the intel they'd gathered, they had a chance to take him down once and for all. As they approached the safe house, Echo pulled the car into an alley, stopping in front of a nondescript door. The three of them piled out quickly and made their way inside. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew the stakes. The war was about to reach its peak. They gathered around the table, the map of the city still pinned to the wall, marked with all the locations they'd just learned about. Simon laid the device down and opened it, showing the others the details they'd uncovered. A long list of addresses, coordinates, and times flashed on the screen. Mark's eyes flicked over the data. The Rook's network was vast, but these were the points that mattered most. They were the ones that could lead them straight to the heart of his operation. The timetable showed the shipments that were coming in, the resources that were moving, everything they needed to make their move. Echo pointed at one of the locations. This is his most important facility. It's heavily guarded, and it's where he keeps his most valuable assets. If we hit this one, we hit him hard. Mark nodded. This was it. The Rook had been operating for too long, hidden behind layers of security, using his network to stay one step ahead of anyone who came after him. But now, they had the upper hand. How do we do it? Simon asked, looking at Mark. Mark stared at the map, his mind already working out the plan. We go in fast, hit his men hard, and take out the facility. We've got enough intel to make it a direct hit. We take control of the operation, and we make it clear that the Rook's time is up. Echo was silent for a moment before speaking. This won't be easy. The Rook's network is deep. He won't give up without a fight. I know, Mark replied, his voice low but steady, but it's a fight we're ready for. Simon stood up from the table, his face set in a grim expression. We hit him where it hurts. We take everything. His money, his resources, his people. We make sure there's nothing left for him to rebuild. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he nodded. The endgame was finally in sight. The Rook had built an empire on fear and manipulation, but it was all about to come crashing down. And they would be the ones to make it happen. Echo turned and started gathering his equipment. We'll need backup. We can't take this on alone. Mark's mind raced. They were ready. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. But it was also clear that the Rook wasn't the only danger out there. They had to be prepared for anything. We're not waiting for anyone else, Mark said firmly. We've come this far. It's time to end this. The group moved into action, gathering weapons, securing the safe house, and preparing for the final mission. Mark could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. This wasn't just about bringing down the Rook. This was about finishing what they started. The Rook had made a mistake underestimating them. He thought he could hide behind his network, behind his wealth, behind his power. But Mark and his team had proven time and time again that they weren't afraid of the darkness he controlled. As they loaded up, Mark's thoughts were clear. They were about to enter the lion's den, but they weren't afraid. They were ready to face whatever came next. And the Rook? He would learn that there was one thing more dangerous than an empire built on fear. It was an enemy who had nothing left to lose. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?